Hello, team. Welcome to another Tippling Philosopher ATP Geopolitics video. God, that's the first time I said the full Tippling Philosopher there. ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is a slightly different one. I'm not going to be talking much about Ukraine, although it will come up because actually there are some interesting little nuggets to do with foreign policy and Ukraine, but we're going to be talking about the UK elections. I've given you an election primer previously on a video, and we will be touching on some of those topics again tonight to just make sure that we all understand where we are with regard to the UK election. I know many of the viewers will be foreign viewers, not necessarily British viewers, but nonetheless, we're going to recover some old ground. I'm joined tonight with my mate Rob. So Rob, who has a channel, Transcendent Psychologist.
Transcendent Psych or Transcendent Psychotherapist sometimes, yeah.
Psychotherapy, yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
Which I should know because I've watched it. But anyway, Rob is joining us. Basically, this is going to be Rob and I down a pub drinking a pint while speaking to you guys. Because it's UK elections, I've chosen a good old British beer, Asahi, Japanese, but I'm going to have it in a handle to make myself feel like I'm British. A little bit more, but we're going to talk UK elections, and you guys can have a chat in a live, obviously, and hit us with any questions. We aren't massively expert on all the manifestos. I mean, the Lib Dem manifesto is 116 pages long, right? So I do enough research on Ukraine and whatnot to not have too much time to look into all these, the ins and outs of every single manifesto, but we are going to be looking at the manifestos and looking at a comparison of the manifestos and talking about just what our prediction to the election will be, what the state of affairs is with the UK election system and with this election. Rob, do you want to introduce yourself at all in whatever way you see fit?
Yeah, so I've known Jono for a long time. We used to teach together, so go back a long way, and we've done Tippling Philosophers together. So we've chewed the cud many a time on philosophy, politics, psychology, whatever you like, down the pub.
Religion.
Yeah, and this is a sort of near equivalent. So yeah, just we're not experts. We just want to sort of chew the cud, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's an opening question, right? So first of all, laying the groundwork would be that we live in a representative democracy where there are 650 constituencies around the UK, and in order for a government to be formed initially, they would have to get half of that 650 set of constituency seats for members of parliament. So they'd have to get half of that 325 plus 1, 326, and that would give you a majority. And we have a first past the post voting system that we'll talk about in a second. But here's an interesting question for Rob. And I actually don't know the answer to this. So Rob, who are the local candidates standing in our constituency? You and I live in the same constituency.
Well, I've got the actual leaflets over on the other table. I could run and get them, but I think the point you're trying to make maybe is that we don't know who they are. Yeah,
and you and I are really politically literate, right? As in compared to the nation as a whole. And I purposely didn't look because I wanted to show that it's not a gotcha. This is an interesting point that we are supposed to be voting for our local member of parliament or local candidate for member of parliament, and yet two of us who kind of know what we're talking about to some degree do not know our local candidates other than the existing standing MP for our area for the Conservatives, who is a woman called Caroline Dinenage, right? And she's sort of famous. She's a daughter of a TV personality, Fred Dinenage, and we know who she is. I've argued with her on the side of the street before, but we don't know who's running against her. And there's every chance that both of us might be voting for a party that's running against Caroline Dinenage. So what do you think that says about the electorate as a whole in terms of this election?
Yeah, what does it say about the candidates? I've not seen anyone come knocking on the door, for example. Does that mean Caroline Dinenage?
There's a lot of doors to knock on, though.
There are, yeah, but it doesn't feel like it's being targeted massively as a seat. Maybe, I don't know. But what does it say about the electorate? I don't know. I mean, is it something about disengagement with local politics, perhaps?
I think it's more. I guess the point I was sort of going to make is that I am going to be voting in this election for someone to represent me locally, to sort out the potholes on the roads, to sort out local issues, but I'm not voting on local issues, I'm voting on national issues. And, and I think that that's what that says to me, is that actually many of us are not interested. I think particularly in this election, maybe in other elections it would be different, but there's a flavour of this election that this is a national election, which of course it is, but it's a referendum on the present government and on a change of a national approach, as opposed to who we want to represent us to fix all the problems we have locally. Would you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe it's, it was interesting. I was watching the news earlier. I think it was ITV, and they were going around showing pictures of like Keir Starmer and saying, "But do you know who this guy is?" And they'd be like, "No, don't know who he is." Yeah, it's like,
yeah.
I mean, we debate. I remember ages ago us debating. Actually, I turned to Claire, my missus, and said, "Actually, do you think actually there's some sort of onus on the electorate? We put all the pressure on the politicians and whatnot to step up and to win our vote and schmooze us around or what have you. But actually, shouldn't there be a bit of pressure on the electorate to take responsibility?" To find out, we debated years ago. I remember causing a little bit of a stir in a discussion, wasn't it? Saying, actually, I don't agree with this now, by the way, but should people, like, literally, if you think about it, like if we have a democracy, the rule of the people, democratos, right, as opposed to the rule by, say, a king or a queen, like that, if you had a good king or good queen, you would expect that good king or good queen to be competent at running that nation, that country. All right. So if you make the demos, the people that are running the country, they need to be competent and kind of worthy, if you like, of making those decisions. So you should be informed. Should you have a test that you should know at least a very basic, we do it for driving. You have to have a basic theory test to be able to drive on the roads, so we don't knock people's prams and dogs over or what have you, but we let people just choose at random based on what, who's going to have their finger on the nuclear button.
Based on who their parents voted for. I think this is a really interesting discussion. We've had this many times, which is exactly as you say. Like you have to pass certain sort of benchmarks in order for you to be able to drive. The regulations are put in place for the safety of others, right, and for yourself. Now, what about the political safety of others? Like if you're voting for someone who's particularly dangerous, or you're just being ignorant, careless with your votes, like why should there not be a minimum sort of regulatory benchmark that you have to reach so that you can prove that you are safe with your vote? And I think that's a really, like, it becomes elitist, right? But it's an interesting concept nonetheless.
Yeah, and I do disagree with it, because I think generally we need to, there'd be all sorts of problems with that in practice actually, but the principle, I guess the principle behind it, that actually people should take responsibility and not just leave it to.
Yeah. Mr. Squirrel says, aren't potholes local councils? Yes, they are. They are the purview of local councils, but also you go to your local MP with issues, and you have these what they called MS moment.
Oh, surgery.
Like surgery. Thank you. I was going to say like doctors. Yeah, you go to a surgery and you vent your spleen, and then they kind of sort that out. And yet here we are. I'm going to vote for someone who I don't even know. I don't even know the name of it at the moment. And I'm someone that should know that. I've actually spoken to canvassers, and I've looked at leaflets, and I've read manifestos. But it's just, but for me, that's not important. What is important to me is the national picture. So in fact, that's probably a good time to have a look at some of these issues. Oops, that's not what I wanted to show. So I'll take that off. Let me move my whole screen. I will be looking sideways at the moment if I look over there, but otherwise everything is over here. Right, so we're going to look at how elections kind of work in the UK first. And sorry to repeat myself for those viewers who have seen this previously. So at the moment in the UK, we have a system called first past the post. Like many post-colonial nations in the world, it seems to be only nations who were, generally there are a couple of others, but mainly nations who have been part of the British Empire that still have first past the post. The US electoral system is by and large that. And what that means is whoever gets the most votes It doesn't. They don't have to get over 50%. You just first past the post. If you win the race, you get more votes than anyone else. You win that race. You become the MP, and that has some advantages, but also has I would say a whole host of disadvantages, because it means that traditionally, for example, in my constituency, my vote has been wasted every single election, because the Conservatives have such a massive majority here that if you vote for anyone else, that vote just basically, you might as well not get out of bed and vote, because I have no representation. And indeed, it's unlikely that the party, that say the Conservative Party, are going to look at how many people voted not for the Conservatives in my constituency and change their policies on account of that. So I feel very strongly that although there are drawbacks to both systems, it is overwhelmingly more advantageous and more representative to have some kind of proportional representation, of which there are many varieties. And here's an example. So this is the 2019 elections, right? And in 2019, if we had proportional representation, so STV, a version of it, right, the Conservatives would have lost 53 seats. The Scottish National Party, SNP's 18 seats, and most other parties would have gained. So why we haven't had any reform of the electoral system in the last few parliaments is because the Conservatives would lose out, and actually, strangely, the SNP. Often the Labour can gain as well. It's just weird, interesting here that they have lost. And actually, we go and look at the previous elections, probably more relevant to our present election. So this is the 2015 election. And here are the votes, right? And well, here are the seats won, sorry. So getting over 325, just the Conservatives did that. This was when they had to did they have to do a deal with the DUP at that point? Labour had this many seats, and actually Conservatives and Labour would have had fewer seats under a type of proportional representation, and the SNP would have had fewer seats. In fact, the SNP is a party that has the fewest number of votes per seat. So they do the best out of first past the post. And UKIP, who had one seat, had 4.8 million votes, and they only got one seat. So I don't agree with UKIP, and I didn't at the time. They don't exist particularly anymore. It's now sort of reform, but they should have been represented in Parliament. They should have had something like 80 seats, 80 MPs, and they had one, which is deeply unfair, because all the people that voted for UKIP were not represented in Parliament. The Lib Dems would have been the third biggest party, but they were behind the SNP. They would have had over 50 seats. I think they had 11, was it at the time, or was it 8? The Greens had one MP, and they would have had something like 25 or so MPs. So this is desperately unfair. And here's the amount of votes per MP. So it's 3.8 million, not 4.8. 3.8 million for UKIP, and it was 1.3 million or something like 1.2 million for Green per MP. So it's not representative of what people believe across the nation. And indeed, just to let you know what the last election looked like. Sorry, I've done a lot of talking, Rob. Just trying to get the groundwork done. So this is a map of the electoral. This is the electoral map for 2019 for UK. What's interesting here, you will notice that it's massively blue, and that's because the larger seats, constituencies in the UK are rural. And when you get highly densely populated areas, urban areas, then they're much smaller constituencies. So if you were to zoom in on London there, it looks like that, which is overwhelmingly Labour. And this is what you see around the world, which is the left wing generally does well in urban areas and the right wing generally does well in rural areas. This is different from previous maps because the Lib Dems used to have a stronghold in the southwest. They are expected to take that back this election. So this will go yellow or orangey in this part of the UK, but also because the Tories are expected to get a right good tonking, a lot of the south, the affluent south. I live on the south coast here. This is an affluent neck of the woods, and can be fairly rural, but the Tories do very well there. They are touted to lose a lot of seats in what are called the home counties, in maybe, you know, Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, even up into Norfolk and Suffolk, and some of these places that are really strong Conservative strongholds, and they're looking to lose because it's going to be a bit of a landslide. And we'll talk about all the details of that later. Scotland, overwhelmingly SNP. That used to be Labour. And in order for Labour to get in, I spoke to Rob earlier. He said, do you remember you used to talk about how Labour would not get in? Labour wouldn't have got in had reform not existed, or they wouldn't have got in it so easily. And again, we'll talk about that later. But Scotland is overwhelmingly SNP. Labour are looking at taking some of those back, possibly some Lib Dem as well. And the North is looking like it's going to go back to be very much Labour run, like it used to be. Now, that map, it can be a little bit disingenuous because all the constituencies have different sizes. If you reduce the constituencies to the same size on the map, then that's what the map would have looked like. So that was 2019. And what we're looking at now is polling that suggests that Labour are going to do very well. Is there anything you want to say about proportional representation and voting at the moment?
I was just interesting, like, thinking about Northern Ireland, because I was hearing yesterday about, so I think Sinn Féin's doing better. So that brings up, just obviously not to miss out anyone that might be listening for that neck of the woods. But in terms of, you know, their campaign for a united Ireland, so for those that aren't used to UK politics, Sinn Féin are kind of like a Republican party from the south, so represented in the north. With that sort of power sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland, but they're demographically the kind of, I suppose, what traditionally would have been a Catholic population more, but probably less so now. But the more Southern Irishy population, if you like, are growing quicker, I think, than the kind of your more like loyalist population, which are the large measure, again, ex-Scots living in that moved over to Ireland. If you go back into the history of it, more Protestant. But yeah, so that bodes to an interesting possible change, because I was thinking that could potentially mean the united Ireland and Northern Ireland becoming part of the EU.
Yeah, so Northern Ireland, we're not going to speak too much about Northern Ireland because I don't have the expertise, and Scotland actually as well in terms of the SNP. But Sinn Féin don't go and sit in Westminster. There are devolved parliaments in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Northern Ireland one has been a bit off and on, whether it's actually even functioning. But Sinn Féin don't come and sit in Westminster, so they won't do any deals with anyone in particular. But yeah, certainly things are changing there. It's become, as we've kind of modernized, people I think are outgrowing kind of voting in tribal ways. And I think statistics bear this out. People are much more prepared to change their voting habits throughout their lives now compared to in previous times. So you used to kind of vote for what your parents voted for, and you'd stick with that all your life. I mean, my dad would never consider voting for anything other than Conservative. It just wouldn't feature.
Reform, maybe.
Well, yeah, actually, yeah. You could think that. So, that's a situation there. So if we look at the latest polls, just to give you a sense of where things are at now, interesting, Labour have just dropped a bit actually, and there was. We'll come on to this a little bit later. There was a declaration today from Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, which I think is a reaction to possibly bleeding a little bit to reform. But here we have 39% on Labour, 21% for Conservatives, Reform on 16%. They're kind of the new manifestation of reform. Liberal Democrats on 11%, Greens on 7%, so a bit of a tick up from Greens, SNP 3%, and Plaid Cymru 1%. But of course, they only feature in Scotland and Wales, respectively. So my take on what is going on at the moment is that there is going to be a landslide victory for Labour, but it is not really a vote for Labour as much as it is a vote against the Conservatives. I don't think people are particularly excited about Labour. I think people are excited about the change. And I think people have got really fed up with Conservatives with this one scandal after another. And we're going to talk about policies soon. Reform are the single reason that Labour are going to have a landslide. because as I've mentioned to you guys before, who have watched me previously, the right wing has never been explicitly split in its vote. The Conservatives have only ever been split by UKIP, who also took from Labour in 2015 and onwards. So when the Conservatives have been split, the left have been split as well or more. This is the first year that Reform have predominantly aid parties predominantly stolen from the Conservatives, and so the right is split. And that means Labour, not only do you have disaffection with the Conservatives, but you've got the Reform coming along. So really, you should add 16% to Reform and add to Conservatives, and you get 37%. And look, you're very close to each other. So the reason there's a big gap is solely because of Reform. Is that, are you cool with that?
Yeah, no, I would say that definitely. And is it worth? I know some of your audience are more either US maybe or even Ukraine. I don't know.
European.
European. Is it worth kind
Australia.
of just outlining roughly where the parties line up equivalently for?
Funny you should say that, my friend. So I couldn't find a decent recent one with Reform. Here's a simplistic. This is quite simplistic. If you swap UKIP for Reform, right? Simplistically, you would have Reform on the far right, but we're talking a little bit about how some of their policies are actually on the left, and they're kind of all over the place. You've got the Conservatives on the centre right, but they've been drifting to the right because they've been afraid of Reform. So they've been trying to battle Reform by moving further to the right. You've got the Lib Dems, who traditionally were centrist, but I would actually say are centre left now. And the Labour Party that is basically centre left, but's now gone centrist. And you've got the Greens, who have adopted the traditional left. So the Greens have basically said, oh, Labour have moved that way, we're going to be left. And actually, you can argue that Lib Dems have gone left of, some people are saying Lib Dems are now left of Labour, which is very interesting. That's a really simplistic appreciation of that. I'm going to show you this one as well, because although we're not going to, this is not about Brexit, we need to understand what Brexit did to the electorate with each party to understand why there is some positioning like there is at the moment. So here we have a left-right here with this line in the middle is the centre. And this purple area is who voted to leave the EU. I do like this graphic. It is pretty cool. Now, if you swap Reform for UKIP, you're broadly going to be in the right zone. I doubt you'd have many Reform voters other than new young voters, and that's an interesting move, who would have voted Remain, right? So let's assume that Reform is UKIP. You had a lot of Conservative voters who voted to leave the EU, but you also had some Labour voters. UKIP stole a bunch of Labour voters, and also Labour voters who remained with Labour also voted leave. So at the time, Jeremy Corbyn was running, was in charge of the Labour, or he was afterwards, and he was a leaver himself. Really, he wasn't pro EU, and the Labour Party didn't have an official line on whether you should remain or leave, and nor did the Conservatives, because they knew they both had these sections of their electorate who were leave and remain and unsure. And so on the Remain side, you had most people on the left, more people on the left voted for Remain than people on the right. More people on the right voted for Leave than on the left, but it wasn't completely so. So that's why you've got these diagonal lines. And the Lib Dems sitting here on the left, SNP, Greens and Plaid Cymru sit on the left. So this is basically, most parties are on the left apart from the Conservatives. Traditionally, you would have only had the Conservatives on the right. And that's why the Conservatives never had their vote split. But in England, you had the left being split 3 ways between Labour, Lib Dems and Greens. And in Scotland, 4 ways between Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and SNP. And in Wales, 4 ways between Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and Plaid Cymru, which meant it's very difficult, traditionally, has been very difficult for Labour to win a majority. They have to have a landslide like they had in 1997 in order to win that majority. Okay, so that's where we are with the lay of the land. Does that make sense, Rob? And would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think when there's some things that changed in terms of the SNP in Scotland since 1997. I remember when you said that kind of Labour's never going to get in again because of that. They moving people, Labour voters moving to the SNP, I think, basically.
Yes. So in order to get 326 MPs, Labour used to depend on about 40 MPs from Scotland, something like that, and that obviously added to their that went into their pot of 326. And what happened since 1997 is the SNP grew and grew and grew, and we had Scottish independence referendum, and the Labour voters moved to the SNP, and Labour, as you can see there, only got one seat in 2019. Right, so that meant that it was even more difficult for Labour to get in. Not only was their vote split, but they'd lost an absolute bucket load of seats up in Scotland, and that meant they would have to get some kind of massive landslide to win this. But what's happened in this election is not only have Reform split the right vote, split Conservatives, but SNP have had a load of scandals that have meant that people have gone back to Labour to get a change away from the SNP. And had that not have happened, and had Reform not turned up, you'd have a very different electoral map. Is that fair enough? Yeah. Cool beans. Okay, so
well, maybe to think about how, I mean, would you say, like, if we compared that political spectrum, say, to, I don't know, going back to like Thatcher's time in the 80s, so the Conservatives, I would say, probably, this might be interesting explaining what's happened to them a little bit, that maybe the Conservatives, like the whole of society in a sense, has gone more to more liberal in some respects, culturally, but maybe right economically.
But you've had pushback against cultural liberalism. Yeah. So you've got some people going culturally to the right. I think you've got polarization probably.
Yeah, which is why I think the Tories are split, in a sense. Which is Brexit kind of taps into that, doesn't it? So you've got that sort of the right wing of the Tory party. I guess that the split within the Conservatives that already existed there is what explains the emergence of Reform UK.
Yes, I think Brexit kind of not weaponized, but immigration was a massive issue. But along with that, at the kind of similar time to that, you've had this a social move to the left. I know this is something that has irked you, and we've had many discussions about this, but kind of this idea of wokeism, however you want to describe that, has come along also since then, to the point where you've also got a lot of people going sort of anti-woke, right? So a reaction against perceived changes, social changes that have been too quick and too vast for specifically more traditional thinkers to cope with, and you've had a reaction against that, to the point where I'm sure it'd be interesting if I look at the Reform manifesto or contract here and put in the term, I wonder if woke is there. So woke ideology, a divisive woke ideology. So there you go. That even features in a political manifesto. And that talks to this idea that there's not only been a move to the left, but there's been a counter move to the right as well. Is that something you would agree with? Sorry, I thought I was showing that to you on the screen, but it wasn't.
Certainly that's the narrative, I think, that is playing out anyway.
So you've got a cultural move to the left, but you've also got and you've got this cultural move to the right. And I think the Conservative Party probably has reacted more to the threat of reform by moving to the right and themselves talking about wokeism. So you'll find Canny Badenoch, you'll find a bunch of Conservative politicians and thinkers rail about woke as well. And I wonder if they haven't actually included the word woke in their manifesto, which doesn't surprise me, but they talk about it quite a lot. This is a real reaction to the threat of reform. Anything else, anywhere you want to take that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose, like, economically, I mean, we can get onto that maybe when we look at questions like tax and the economy. Like, are the Greens actually the proper socialists? Do you know what I mean? So is Labour actually a socialist party anymore? If you think of that in terms of the classic kind of issues around class and opportunity, income, wealth distribution, those kind of classic kind of socialist
Yeah, so
So
yeah, interesting. So I guess before we look at the manifestos, if we go back to, I guess this one might be the good one to look at here. So if we go back to our understanding of where the party sits, and for those Americans out there, and I know this annoys people, but for as far as I'm concerned, the Democrats would sit somewhere like here, very marginally centre left. You would have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, who I know he's not a Democrat, he's an independent that caucuses with the Democrats, but him, Rashida Tlaib, they would sit probably here, like bog standard left in the UK. But the corporate Democrat Party sits marginally centre left. It really is a centrist party from European and UK standards. Well, it depends whether you talk about MAGA republicanism would be here, a kind of UKIP area, and general republicanism, traditional Reagan Republican would sit somewhere like here, just traditionally centre right. Your whole political system in America is actually shifted slightly rightwards, but it's really funny when you have Republicans attack Democrats for being Marxists and socialists and communists when they're talking about like just bog standard Democrats, and for us Europeans it's not even close to being accurate. But anyway, that's a whole different kettle of fish. What might be interesting, so this is understanding where the parties sit here. It's worth thinking where they are going in this election. So the Greens are staying where they are. Lib Dems have moved left because Labour have taken this really big centrist ground. And we're going to talk about this with regard to their manifesto. They are doing what's called the Ming Vase approach, or what some people call that, which is, we understand, and we know this from Clinton's election in the 90s and Tony Blair taking on that same election methodology, which was going to focus groups, finding out what swing voters in the centre wanted, and then taking that on and making a manifesto around that, because you know you win by going to the centre, especially in a two-party system where people don't have an option. So you need to fight over the centre. And this is why I don't understand why Donald Trump is going further to the right. He could absolutely smash the election against Biden, even without the age thing, if he just tried to go to the centre ground a bit more. But he won't. He's going to the right, and that gives the Democrats that fighting chance. So anyway, you win elections by going to the centre, and my goodness me, Labour have taken that on. They've gone so centre and they've gone so safe that they're not sticking their neck out on anything particularly. And some people are saying they're a bit kind of meh. They're getting the votes not because people are excited by that kind of safe Ming Vase approach. They're getting the votes because they don't want the Tories. Let's look, Rob, at the manifestos and the narratives that they might communicate just by looking at the front page of the manifesto.
I was also going to say before we do that.
Yeah, sorry, mate. Yeah.
No, that's right. I was just going to say also, I suppose, like if you compare, say, the Conservatives in the UK to Republicans in the US, there would be a general commitment in the Conservative Party in the UK towards, like, say, the NHS. Like, no parties really, although UKIP's kind of challenging that a bit, but no parties actually. Sorry, yeah, none of them really actually. It's kind of sacrosanct, isn't it? That's a welfare state to some extent. It's nibbled at and done and played out in different ways, but you know, like if you think of Trump getting rid of Obamacare. That wouldn't happen. Conservatives wouldn't get away with that in the UK.
No, so that's a really good point. So a really good point actually shows the difference between the UK and the US, right? So and Europe in general. So in Europe we have single payer healthcare or centralized healthcare, however you want to see it, and that's kind of sacrosanct. There are different versions of this. There are kind of different insurance model versions that you might see in Germany and in France. But in the UK, we've just got National Health Service. Now, it has been nibbled away at, as you say, and successive governments, and that includes the Labour government of the Blair era, have been involved in privatising parts of the NHS, and that's been highly controversial. I'm dead against that. But we've got to a state where actually it's an underfunded service, but it's a cherished service that people don't like being messed with. And so the Conservatives do not have the guts to say, we want to get rid of the NHS and turn it into an American style system. Even if some of them believed it themselves, it's a vote loser. And that shows you a big difference between the US electoral landscape and the British electoral landscape. I think that's a really good point, Rob.
I mean, even Reform UK wouldn't say that. I mean, they're talking about, aren't they, changing the way like paying in advance, say, for a GP appointment, and then you only get the money back if you. So that's a doctor's appointment. If anyone doesn't know what GP appointment, so you get the money back if you turn up, and you lose the money, you forfeit the payment, or they just keep it if you don't turn up. Because obviously we've got a problem with people not turning up to GP appointments, and the system is already under pressure. So yeah.
Well, yeah. So this is the interesting thing about Reform is that because they know, and this infographic is really useful up here to give you an understanding. So assuming Reform sits here in terms of kind of immigration and kind of nationalism and tradition and those kind of things that really float the boat of the Leave voters in terms of Brexit, right? But they also know that they nicked a load of Labour voters, UKIP did. So Reform have come along and said, right, we're the new manifestation of UKIP. We understand that we're going to get all those people who are really, really feeling strong about immigration. But in order to make sure that we get the kind of left-wing version of those people that we got back in 2016 onwards, 2017, we need to make sure that we are appealing to the working class left-winger, right? So your typical Labour voter who went to UKIP, they were kind of stolen by UKIP for a short while and then went back to Labour. Reform has said we need to get them back, but the way we need to get them back, because this isn't a vote on the EU and it's not so big as that, although it's on immigration, that might not be enough of a sweetener to get those voters. So we need to offer them some left-wing, traditionally kind of left-wing policies. So Reform have come along and then said, okay, although Nigel Farage has talked about completely reforming the NHS personally, their contract or their manifesto has stated that the NHS will be, yes, massively reformed, but they're going to cut waiting lists by upping the spending massively. They're going to keep retention. They're going to retain NHS staff members. And this is a really good policy from Reform. And I'm not a fan of Reform, right? But they want to write off debt, like student debt for nurses and doctors, right? After, I think, a certain amount of time. If you work for the NHS for 10 years, then you get your student debt written off. So you're not rushing off to Australia and New Zealand and Canada to get qualified in the UK, then sod off to there. So it's a sweetener to keep you in the UK, so that because they don't want the UK employing all of these the Reform, I mean, going to be a bit caustic here, but the Reform, what happened is we came out the EU and we lost all the Eastern European immigration. So we had a lot of doctors. I have personal experience with this. I've got progressive multiple sclerosis. My first neurologist was Polish. And then he eventually went back to Poland after, Brexit happened. And what happened is we needed those staff members. We didn't have to pool the staff members ourselves. We weren't retaining them. They're going off to foreign countries themselves in kind of emigration. And so we were getting black and brown, predominantly immigrants coming in to fulfill the needs in the NHS. And so Reform is saying we don't want that. So therefore, we need to keep our indigenous population in the NHS. And so we need to give sweeteners to those people. It will also stop immigration as well as being good for the NHS intrinsically. So they want to spend loads of money on the NHS. They want to give tax breaks for staff, even for 3 years. Tax breaks also for private healthcare providers to help them get the waiting list down, and so on and so forth. So that's an example of how Reform are thinking about left-wing policies, as well as they are wanting to invest in the NHS. Okay. Let's look at the narratives then as the next thing. Let's go to the Conservative parties. This is their kind of tagline: clear plan, bold action, secure future. And this is their colour scheme. What would you say about that, Rob?
It kind of makes me. It's kind of rich, isn't it? You've just had 14 years in government. and it's like clear plan. But so their classic one, which they're obviously trying to sell themselves on. Rishi's made one of his, what was it, 5 pledges, wasn't it, around stop the boats or whatever. The Rwanda, I don't know what you call it, extradition, or trying to break the kind of the trafficking gangs, I guess. And it's been roundly criticised for it basically not.
So just to let international viewers know that one of the ways to deal with immigration was supposedly to take illegal immigrants who have come on small boats, sort of kind of round them up, if you like, put them on an airplane and send them to Rwanda. That's a kind of the summary of it. But people were up in arms, not so much about the actual process, because actually some European countries have taken this on recently, but it's the fact that Rwanda wasn't safe. It was not deemed, like, technically it's not a safe country. So you're going to take these asylum seekers who have come from an unsafe place and say, yeah, we'll sort you out by taking you to Rwanda and dumping them in Rwanda. And so, okay, had it been, say, for example, dumping them in I don't know, Sweden, people would have been a lot more on board. But it's the fact that you're taking them to a country that hasn't been deemed safe. But also people were against it for just the whole notion of taking asylum seekers and dumping them somewhere else. But anyway, sorry, let's just let people know. So carry on.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking as well, like, bold action. Looking at the main Conservative points, there's nothing inspiring in there. I can't see anything particularly. And there's a right to buy for housing, but it all seems to sort of fall a bit flat when you just come out of 14 years of government and you could have been doing this.
Yeah.
So that's why I mean it's not a critique. That's not a critique in itself of whether they might do it and they might have a bold and clear plan and whatnot. But it's just it just lacks that credibility when you've
This is what has been said about their national service sort of thing. A real last minute thing to try and appeal, I think, to the kind of middle class older generation who think that the young are just a bunch of layabout lazy sods. And so just as they tabled the election for July the 4th, they came out with this plan to have national service for the young, or St. John's Ambulance, or community service, or whatever. And people are like, okay, if you really thought that was such a good idea, like, why didn't you do it 14 years ago? Why have you just like whacked it out in time for this election? And so there's a lot of this. And I suppose no matter when you call an election, and if you've been in power for that long, you're always going to have those kind of accusations. At some point, you're going to come up with new ideas. But there is definitely this there's some rationale behind if it was such a good idea, you've had 14 years to have implemented it, and you haven't.
I mean, their pushback is, well, we had COVID to deal with, which is true. But I was listening to an interview this morning on BBC with a Conservative MP, and she was saying, set aside the pandemic because the NHS waiting lists were going up before the pandemic. So the trend was already there. So you can't just use the pandemic as a way to get yourselves off the hook from that. Even though it is true and it has impacted things,
So you've got a colour scheme there that's very much like red, white, and blue. Obviously, the Union flag, and you've got the rule of 3. 3 words. Mehdi Hassan talks about this in his book. I don't know how to win debates or whatever. 3 people come out with, get Brexit done was the Conservative Party's previous one, or the one
Stay
before
safe,
that.
Keep your distance, wash your hands, or I don't know, whatever it was during the pandemic.
Yeah. And so Labour in 1997 was education. That's what they ran on. And yeah, really, there is something about the 3. But I told you, have you seen the narrative earlier, when we spoke on the phone? I said, have you seen a narrative for the Conservative Manifesto, or the tagline? And you're like, no. I said, it's three things, and what is it? It's something and something about secure at the end. Like, actually, I don't, that's not memorable enough for me. Clear plan, bold action, secure future.
It tells me something about their state of mind. It's really unimaginative. It looks like the sort of thing you might put on selling a glue packet in the local DIY shop.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, I don't think they're feeling it. I think they are quite deflated and defeated.
Yes. Yeah. And so this is interesting. This is not a rule of three here. And basically this sums up their entire campaign, which is change. Just change. And it's not for something. It's not some great idea. It's just like, get rid of these fucking idiots. That's basically
if I was running the
what it
next
is.
campaign at the end of this, I'd bring this back up if I was the opposition and say, shortchanged, ? But it's funny. I know you haven't asked me what I think of this, but it made me laugh equally. Like the Conservative one was like, change. You kind of, then you've got this bland black and white, very grey picture of Starmer there. It's like, again, it's not inspiring.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, neither of the two. They've been called the uni party, aren't they, or the mono party, the Tories and Labour. And it's like, I know there are differences, but a lot of people are feeling that this is just a big block of the, fighting.
That's a really, it's interesting. I've not heard that being used, but I have in America. So that's I think being imported from America. That's what MAGA Republicans say about Democrats and kind of mainstream Republicans. They call them uniparty. So I think that's been imported from MAGA. Interesting. But yeah, so that the narrative here is change, and that's what they're running on, which is just different from them. You don't like them. No one likes them at the moment. You look at the polls. I mean, I'm not trying to be partisan here. Like, literally, this is what's going on, is that the Conservatives have tanked and they realize this. So their manifesto is just, change. And that's it. And that's all they need to do. So on one hand, it's quite effective. Like, you kind of understand what's going on here. On the other hand, it's very vague. And actually that's the case with the manifesto itself. The Lib Dems for a fair deal. So they're and they often do play on the sense of fairness. Their manifesto is probably the biggest manifesto of a lot. It's 116 pages. Anything particular about that?
I mean, it's more colourful. I mean, I'm not, that sounds like trite comment. I mean, literally, I'm not trying to be partisan here either, but it's like just my instant reaction to the aesthetic, because I think the aesthetic is telling you something that looks a little bit. And it's interesting. Like, I suppose I've kind of found it funny. Ed Davey, the leader, his campaign. It makes sense. We discussed this earlier, didn't we? Like, every time I see him on TV, he's like paddle boarding, and then doing some gimmick where he's running around the field with a trolley or doing something. It was very gimmicky. But like you said, you made the good point, actually. Yeah, but their problem historically has been they just don't get the press coverage.
Yeah.
So he's been trying to do that. Interestingly, I think there was a scandal or something he was involved in where there was a bad news story anyway. I don't know her name, but she's been on Question Time, I think. She's obviously a front member of the party. She's got like short, white, grey hair, very articulate, actually.
Yeah.
And she seems to have been pushed to the fore, and he's been pushed to do kind of like roll around in the background on the toys. But the colours here.
A lot of people took the mickey out of this, right? A lot of people. The media went to town on him. He's paddleboarding, going down a roller coaster, doing this, doing that, and you're like, oh, what a joke. But actually, they have complained, the Lib Dems, for a long time, that they get no press coverage because they don't own any media, right? The Conservatives basically have the media on their side in terms of the print media. Labour have got Guardian and the Mirror, and Lib Dems might have had the Independent in the old days, but that's now not only on digital. And Reform have probably got, say, Daily Express, Daily Mail, maybe to a degree. But Lib Dems don't get any airtime, and they have complained consistently that they don't get enough of a platform to give across their views. And so what he did by doing these silly things, and people were kind of poking fun at them for doing that, but actually, by poking fun at them, you are getting them on TV, and all it's just oxygen. All publicity is good publicity. And actually, although you were like, oh, that's ridiculous, that I've seen some analyses to state that they actually got more out of that approach than they thought they previously would have done. So interesting. So Reform here, this is their manifesto, which is our contract with you.
Mm-hmm. It's, yeah, interesting as well. The thing that strikes me, I've not seen this already, but the thing that strikes me there, well, someone was saying the other day to Nigel Farage, of course, you realise a contract is a legal binding document.
Yeah.
You might get sued if you don't deliver on it. But it's very clearly centering on him as a personality. And you think like what's happened in the polls since he decided to throw his hat in the ring. That's when things have gone up. Yeah.
So that big spike there, if you guys can see that, is when Nigel Farage announced that he was running. So Nigel Farage was originally going to go and campaign for Donald Trump for the election in America. And he said, I'm not going to be involved in this election. And something happened, I don't know. And he did a volte-face and came back to the UK and said, I'm going to stand in Clacton, which is the only seat that UKIP had. And it's the safest place that he could think of going. And then they went up. So people vote for reform for Nigel Farage. I've seen loads of Vox Pops and analyses of these interviews that have shown that people that vote for reform are voting for Nigel Farage, as in they say, even though he's not in their constituency, right? Like, so say in my local area where Nigel Farage is not standing, if you went to say, who are you going to vote for? They say, I'm going to vote for Nigel Farage. So it's him that they're voting for.
Kids call him Uncle Nige. Yeah.
Really? Yeah. So I think yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you go back to that poll again, if you look at the symmetry between Labour and Conservative, those big, they're that big peaks. It's almost like, so it's the opposite symmetry. And then when you see Reform rising, that's when the symmetry breaks.
Yeah, well, no, they're symmetry, but instead of an inverse symmetry, it is a symmetry. It's a perfect symmetry. Labour go down and Conservatives go down because Reform go up.
Previously, up until
it was an inverse.
They're taking it off of each other.
Yeah.
Now it's being robbed off both of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So some people are saying Reform are only. I think back here, Reform were taking off Conservatives, but I think there is a drift away. I think they're starting to take Labour voters, and I've seen up north, particularly, a lot of Labour voters saying that they're going to vote Reform, which is very interesting because today this came out, and I don't know about this. I think this is incredibly risky because I already know one of my mates contacted me saying I was going to vote Labour tomorrow and I'm not going to vote for them now. He literally said, this has changed my vote. So Keir Starmer came out today and said, Britain will not rejoin the EU in my lifetime. He's insisted the UK will not rejoin either the EU, the single market, or the customs union within his lifetime, in his firmest pledge yet that Labour will not seek much closer relations to Europe for as long as he is Prime Minister. Now, there's some interesting thinking to go into this. That my initial reaction was he said that because he's worried about Reform voters, about Labour voters drifting to Reform. And indeed, my mate who said that he had heard those rumours. But you are going to lose, particularly your middle class Labour voter Remainers, who have traditionally been all right with Labour's kind of vague positioning on Europe, thinking, oh, we'll get back in at some point. Like, my mate is an absolute dyed-in-the-wool Remainer. Right. And he's like, I will never vote for Labour now while that is their position on the EU. So it's thinking, right, we're going to gain these or not bleed these people, but then we will bleed these people. And those Remainers might well go to either the Greens, who said we are going to rejoin the EU, or to Lib Dems, who said we're going to join the customs union as a step towards rejoining the EU. So but your thought was different.
Well, two things I'm thinking. One is, I suspect, we talked about this on the phone, they will have immense amounts of data they'll be calculating very carefully all their decisions on. So yeah, there'll be that demographic like your mate that they will know that will be enough to dissuade them, but there will be enough information to think we need to shore up that wall against going off to Reform or what have you. What was the other thing I was going to say?
What you told me earlier was that, and I think this is absolutely right. So your man Starmer is not going to say this without knowing that there's data behind this. So you'll find that these days in politics, the messaging is so freaking scientific. It's analyzed, and there will be polling data behind why he said that. That was your point, right?
Yeah. And there was a second point. It will come back to me, hopefully.
Yeah, but so it's a calculated statement, not just an off the cuff statement. Possibly.
Yeah, I was thinking the other thing. I don't know. I really literally don't know anything about this, but I'm wondering: is he sort of fairly confident now, and he's kind of like trying to offset their being plagued as the Conservatives have by the shadow of the EU and Euroscepticism, Euro politics coming back over the Labour Party as a dominant party. Maybe thinking ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I think he's just trying to keep the working class Leave voters. Usually, I mean, it's not. I'm simplifying. Here's the Green Party, the final one. We're not going to do SNP implied Cymru. Sorry, we just don't have time. But how do you see this as the Green Party manifesto?
Again, not inspiring me, but they've probably got big ideas. It's not really reflected in the. They probably got one of the parties with big ideas, and possibly some, I don't agree with them a lot of stuff, but it's going to. But why that's not inspiring in terms of it's a very plain cover.
Yeah, I think, and actually, this is the PDF version of it. It does on the website. It's actually quite interactive, and you go to each different area. So it's not this. This is the PDF version. But what I was just thinking, and this just came to me, is the use of the word "real." So why do you think I always talk with my audience about the importance of words? And of course, when you're talking about stuff like this, the words are very carefully chosen, right? Real is an important word.
Well, it's implying that the change, full stop, of Labour is not real, I'd imagine.
My synopsis, my theory is that the Green Party are doing what Green parties in Europe have done. So Green parties in Europe have adopted a much more sensible, not that Green policies aren't sensible, but much more pragmatic and realistic policy platform. So you look at the Greens in Germany that have been in coalition plenty of times. They aren't just platforming like green policies. They actually have a range of kind of left-leaning socialist policies that will be talking to people interested in education, in healthcare, so on and so forth. So this is like, yeah, we like 10 years ago, it would have been hope and change. Now it's no, this is a real hope. Like this can be achieved. This is actually a doable thing. This hope is realistic, and this change will make a real change. Really will make a change to your lives, but it's a realistic change. Like I think the Greens are starting to enter a period of electoral political history in the UK where they are seeing themselves as an actual player in the game. And if you move to proportional representation, then they would be a player in the game. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we are going to go to foreign policy, because I know you guys are mainly interested in like Ukraine and whatnot. Here on the BBC is a really useful part of the BBC website, which allows you to compare in a kind of summary form the policies for as many parties as you want. I've selected the 5 parties that we're talking about, and we're going to look at foreign defense. And the first thing I'm going to say is, if you go to the Reform, the PDF here, their manifesto, or contract as they call it. He said manifesto is a word that's associated with lies, and we know that people lie about their manifesto, so we're going to call it a contract. It's like, and as you say, well, surely that's legally binding then. And but anyway, if I do Control F
only
and put
get
in,
elected.
yeah, well, this is if I put in Ukraine,
yeah,
you will find that Ukraine does not feature in the manifesto at all. So Reform, of all the 5 parties, I could show you that with all the other parties, but of all the 5 parties, Reform is the only party that is the only manifesto that doesn't include anything on Ukraine. And I think, given what we know about Nigel Farage and his connections to Putin and Russian appeasement, I think that's exactly what you would expect. And I think that tells you really quite a lot.
What does it say about spending? Because so you've got Conservatives 2.5, like yada yada.
Okay, so if we go through, so the Conservatives want to spend 2.5% of the GDP on defence to qualify for NATO, and they're up for staying in NATO. Labour want to retain 2.5% of GDP and remain in NATO. They want to have nuclear. They're up for Trident nuclear deterrent. Liberal Democrats as well, although they don't talk about a percentage of GDP, but they are actually quite strong on defence as well, because they realise the state of play of the world at the moment is pretty precarious. And they're pretty big on that. We can talk about Palestine, Gaza in a second. Now, the Green Party
time frame on their meet commitments.
No, and that's an issue with particularly with Labour, I think, is the vagueness of when they're going to do certain things and maybe the funding for those things. But so there is that. Liberal Democrats cancel plans to cut 10,000 soldiers. I mean, we already have a very meager armed forces compared to what we used to, and you know, Conservatives might talk a big talk here, but they are planning on making even more cuts, bold accounts. Lib Dem say meet NATO commitments and maintain the UK's nuclear deterrent while still pursuing multilateral global disarmament. So in other words, yeah, we're up for people not having nukes, but we'll keep ours, thanks. So yeah, Green Party, interestingly, although they're against Trident, so they would get rid of our nuclear deterrent, or at least the new nuclear deterrent, which is very expensive. There are also, I don't want to get into Trident at the moment, but there are lots of arguments concerning how much we would be beholden to the United States, that the technology, that we couldn't even use these things without basically permission from the United States. So as a nuclear nation, we are somewhat beholden to the US. But they, interestingly, and this happened, what was it, in 2023, the Green Party switched their position on NATO. So the Green Party are now up for the UK remaining in NATO. So again, when you go back to the idea that the Green Party want to be seen as a realistic proposition, then I think something like that is talking to the centre ground a lot more than your firebrand left-wing liberalism. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I was just thinking there of like, so we talk about climate emergency.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't use no first use of nuclear weapon, but we might do the strike back, and then we've got a climate emergency on our hands, surely.
Yeah. But even that is like, you know, they're talking about it is not. I don't think you would have seen that in foreign policy and defence from the Greens like 20 years ago, right?
It's a move.
Now, Reform says scrap laws based on EU regulations, of course, and abandon the new post-Brexit trade arrangements known as the Windsor Framework. So this is foreign policy as a whole. Increase defence spending to 2.5% of national of GDP. So they are cool with that. Raise pay across the armed forces and aim to increase total army numbers. Create a department for veterans and protect service personnel from civil and human rights claims. This is interesting. So the SAS have just been done for war crimes, basically, or they're in the process of being done in was it Afghanistan or was it in Iraq? And it's interesting that Reform are playing on that kind of nationalistic, we'll support our guys, even if they do like horrible things type thing. And that's an interesting positioning. Reduce the international aid budget by 50%. I always find that fascinating because if you're going to solve immigration issues, you need to be sorting out the reasons why they want to leave the country they're in. And that's what you do with international aid budgets, in my opinion. So if you spend sensible international aid, then that should be working towards minimizing immigration. So you can't just keep putting a sticking plaster on immigration so that you are rounding people up on boats or flying people off to Rwanda. You need to say, what is a problem? Why are people wanting to leave the country they live in to come to the UK? Yes, okay, we're a great country. Okay, we're not going to solve that. We want to stay great. What we want to do is stop this country being a horrible place to live. Otherwise, you don't solve it.
I wonder, because I've heard Farrell talk about, in terms of one of the reasons we've got the migrant crisis, maybe on the more kind of illegal migration problem, which
is a much smaller part of the immigrant problem.
Yeah,
if you see it as that.
Yeah, which the traffickers use. He lays, at least publicly, the blame for that on the wars against Libya and interventions in Iraq. So we discussed this the other week a bit, didn't we? So that's interesting because if you're going to cut aid, let's say, to those countries, but you can see on the other hand that actually causing damage to those countries will lead to more moves for migration. Surely it would make sense also to be a bit more pacifist in certain military situations. Ukraine perhaps being different. We'll talk about that. I know you mentioned it the other day. But surely
let's do that.
You'd also, if you're consistent, wouldn't you also be in favour of, like you said, increasing aid, or maybe not aid, but maybe more careful investment? If it's all about building up the UK's trade capacity internationally, could we invest? Okay, well, there might not be any payback for a while, but actually kind of a kindness payment. We build infrastructure, we help people find jobs, we help better people's lives. But in the longer term, we're going to be creating trading partners, and not creating some of the problems that he's saying we've got because of people fleeing.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because and my audience would really appreciate this conversation. So and there's plenty we can talk about this. I have long discussed how helping Ukraine, as an example, helping Ukraine out, supporting Ukraine in the war against Putin is not a charitable project. This is not about the moral dimension. I mean, it is for you and I, or for me and my audience. Right?
When I said charitable, I was thinking more, say, for example, like Libya or
but exactly. So come on. So but Ukraine has the clearest moral evaluation as well. So what differentiates Ukraine, in my opinion, to Libya and Iraq is that not only is it in the UK and the US's strategic interests to support Ukraine, right? It's also in the moral interest to do so. So you can make the Ukraine argument purely on morality alone. I don't think that would be enough to justify spending the money to support Ukraine from a national budget. But you can make the moral argument, and that's good enough. But actually, all of these strategic geopolitical arguments and actually military industrial arguments and economic arguments and food security, there's all sorts of stuff why Ukraine should be supported, that it ticks every single box, right? When it comes to Libya and Iraq, the moral dimension is much, much smaller. And so therefore, those military projects, for want of a better word, were much more driven by, I think, economic interests. So Iraq was kind of a post hoc rationalization, and after the fact reasoning was like, oh, weapons of mass destruction. But I'm sure that the fact that had huge oil fields and contractors would be able to go in, and economic entities from the US and other countries would be able to go in and take advantage of the natural resources in Iraq and in Libya, played a much bigger role, or at least was the only real role, and maybe geopolitical strategizing as well. But it's going to be drawn around the economic interest, which is why I always use the example of Zimbabwe. Why didn't we go in and help in Zimbabwe against Robert Mugabe? Because there were no natural resources that we needed, and so there was a moral dimension, but it was only a moral dimension.
Apparently Blair was discussing that. Blair wanted to. According to George Galloway.
That's really interesting because that just shows you that morality isn't enough often, especially if you're going to be sending troops in. So you would have to justify why a certain amount of troops had died, sending them to Zimbabwe, and it would be because it was the right thing to do. And then the parents would say, well, we're not the world police. So you often get this with American politics, where people complain that and I used to say this, and when you watch Team America, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the great film, the puppet film of showing, like, playing on this idea that the US just go around the world being the police force of the world and trying to enforce the morality and whatnot. And it's easy to say that, but it's actually really wrong. And I've now 2 years of doing this, I understand why America goes around the world and getting involved. And there's no such thing as a free lunch in this context. And there's no such thing as them going around morally policing for the sake only of morally policing. The moral policing happens if it's also in their strategic geopolitical interest to do so. And that's why America isn't everywhere doing everything, right? Because it would be not worth their while doing that. So the case for supporting Ukraine was initially a moral one when it first happened, but it should have much more quickly become a strategic one, because the American electorate were not sold on supporting Ukraine quickly enough in terms of economics and geopolitics and so on, and American influence, and this chess game between the US and Russia and China.
So here's a theme that might cross a number of currents that you might like and might be interesting to your viewers as well. So did you watch, there was a great video, sorry to plug another channel, on Novara Media the other day. There was a guy they interviewed looking at the amount of investment by the US in the UK, how so much of the UK economy is basically, without us realizing, so many of the shops and companies and what have you, actually, we saw it with Cadbury's, etc., are actually effectively US owned.
Yeah.
And then you think of, like, so you got, effectively, it dawned on me, I kind of knew it, but it dawned on me in a stronger way. We really are, let's say, that's the name of his book, Vassal State.
I was going to say, are you going to say the word vassal state? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the 54th state of the US or what have you. And then you think of the politics. So you think of that kind of going into Libya, going into Iraq, not Iran, Iraq. Then, but with Ukraine, we've been more independent minded, and there's a more kind of alliance and maybe even leading in Europe at a certain point in terms of the stuff we're providing. Would it be better not only for Ukraine, but also for the UK, for us to realign who's pulling our strings and stop being that vassal state? There's the problem of being out of the EU in the way that we are. Right.
Okay. Right, you've just hit on something I've just spent a couple of days banging on about. So I did a video today, my geopolitics video today. No, it wasn't. It's my military aid video that became an extra because it had so much about NATO. So what's going on in the US at the moment? I don't want to retread this, because actually answering this would just be re-saying what I said earlier today. But just a really quick synopsis is that Donald Trump is kind of making moves, or at least people around him are saying there are these moves afoot to, if not pull the US out of NATO, then to reduce its influence in NATO. And it's the idea that Europe are free riding on the US defense provision in Europe, and that we don't pay enough. And it's sort of there's sort of an element of correctness there, but actually not, because it's not like you're paying for something. This is their own defense. They're spending money on their own defense, and that's broadly staying in the US in terms of the industrial side of that. Although they will have wages of people that will then go into local economies as they have troops in Europe. But that is their agency. That's the Americans deciding to do that from the Second World War onwards. That's not us saying, oh, please have all of your bases all over Europe. We're desperate for all your bases all over Europe. That's the Americans saying, we're going to do this as part of our geopolitical strategy, right? It's the Cold War. And now you get this situation where some people in America are saying, you Europeans, you're all free riders. Like, on the coattails of the US. It's like, no, we're not. You decided to do that for the last 70 years. And now you're saying we're not spending enough on defense when you decided to spend shed loads on defense and we didn't, partly because you were in Europe helping with our security, but that was your choice. And so there's this really weird situation where the US are blaming us for their own strategizing.
I mean, it's two ways, isn't it? Because I mean, we've benefited from having a
I don't deny that. I'm not
military budget that we can spend on other stuff, but
absolutely, and I don't deny that. But what I'm looking at, so we need to spend more, and we should have been spending more on defense, right? So I totally get that, but it's the idea of blaming us and the fact that we're free riders when actually it was the agency of the Americans to do that because it fits in with their strategy. So your question was, well, should we actually stand up more on our own 2 feet, like economically and et cetera, and actually if America goes isolationist and starts moving back to its own, like, kind of, we would call Little Englander but Little Americaner, and demand that the EU and UK spend more on defence, etc. The EU have just come up with a military strategy that says, going forward, we intend to spend 60%, at least 60% of our budget internally in the EU on military equipment. Now, if you want the EU to stand up on its own 2 feet more, they will not rely on America as much, and they will not spend on American military industrial complex as much. And so there's two sides to this. That the more Europe stands up on its feet and is independent of the US, the less influence the US has, and the less economic heft they have in terms of arms manufacturing, because actually the EU will buy their own stuff going forward more than American
60%
stuff.
60% of their current military budgets would be spent internally.
And at the moment, I think someone said the other day they spent 80% of it in the US or whatever. So the US is a massive arms exporter, right? So we're getting like F-16s and F-35s and all this kind of stuff. Well, actually, what if the US take a step back from the world stage? First of all, China and Russia will take a step up, and BRICS and this kind of arrangement of other alternative countries will fill that vacuum. But also the EU will stand up on its own 2 feet, which is exactly what Trump wants. But the ramifications of that, the collateral is that the US would lose influence, and they would also lose some economic inward investment or inward, they would lose exports. And so it's not so easy to say you guys need to pay more, right? It's just more complicated than that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend more. I think we should, but there are all sorts of different things going on. Anyway, I've said that like 58 times to my guys, to the team already. But in terms of foreign diplomacy, it's interesting that it featured very little. It features very little across all of the manifestos. They seem to be very much more concerned with domestic issues.
And when you think, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Like, because you've got discussion of like, I mean, when you think like we're only like 2 months away, wasn't it, when the generals were all calling for like national service? We need to be ready to fight a pan-European war potentially in 5 to 10 years. We're woefully understaffed, and then you look at these manifestos and it's like that seriousness it's not really reflected, is it? It's like, we'll aim to, there's discussions I had, is like, I heard them talking about, we aim to get to 2.5% by 2030. Feels quite sluggish.
The problem is if you like, that's a massive load of money, right? And if you say we're going to get there by 2 years' time, then it's a zero-sum game. So that money comes from somewhere, right? And so if you're suddenly having to spend 10 billion extra quid on defense, then that's 10 billion quid you're not spending on hospitals. And so when you're vying for people's, I mean, this is the problem with defense, is that it is, and I've talked about this previously quite a bit, but defense is an insurance policy. That's how I understand defense now. So the more you spend on defense, the better your insurance policy is, so that when you need to draw on it, you get the best cover possible. Right. And so when you're in a war, suddenly everything's in place, because I've been spending every year on really good insurance coverage. And now I've built up all these no claims bonuses or whatever, and everything's in place. Now, if you are not spending on your insurance, when you eventually come around to a war like the Ukraine war, and you have not had very good coverage, you get to the war, like Germany, UK, we've got nothing in our tank left in the tank, in the cupboards, right? Because we've not been spending on our insurance policy. The US has been spending freaking tons on its insurance policy, right? So it's able to help Ukraine out really relatively easily, right? It can send 1,000 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles like that, right? We can't do that because we've not been investing in defense as an insurance policy, which means great, because actually we've got a decent welfare system, and the Americans probably don't have a decent welfare system because they spend more than the next 12 countries combined on defense. They've got freaking brilliant defense, but their welfare system sucks, right? And so it's you've got a finite amount of money. How do you best spend it and generate prosperity? And that's the game of politics, right?
So I wonder, had that bill not passed in the US in terms of the package to Ukraine, because around that time, before that period, that was when Europe was being quite serious around, we need to sort things out, step up our game,
which they have.
I wonder if
Germany particularly,
paradoxically, it's that donation, not questioning that should have been done or not, but I wonder if that package of support to Ukraine has that paradoxically kind of made Europe take its foot off, or British politicians at the very least take their foot off the pedal in terms of what we do.
No, I think that was happening, and everyone still reckoned. Yes, it taking 7 months expedited Europe, like Germany particularly, in doing more. What people are now worried about is mitigating against a Trump presidency. And so Europeans are genuinely worried about that, whilst also trying to deal with, say, in France, the rise of Rassemblement National, who are pro-Russian, coming into power, and the rise of AfD in Germany, who are pro-Russian. And it's rather like Reform, who are the most pro-Russian in the UK political scene. I wouldn't say they're like, not the electorate. I'm talking more about like Farage and the people at the top.
Let's talk about that, because that was interesting, wasn't it? Because that, when that was it, Nick Robinson.
Yes.
It's interesting. I may know less about what else he said elsewhere, but I didn't hear him in the way that people were suggesting. So the way I heard him was kind of saying there are a set of things that NATO, not necessarily even wrongly, that the powers, if you like, the West and the East, have moved closer together. That is more likely to cause anxiety on the Russian side. That I didn't hear him directly excuse, and he's come out since saying, "No, look, let me be very, very clear," and really laying it on the line in terms of it's Putin's fault, it's despicable, it's, you know, whatever. And how much he means that, I don't know. He's obviously wanting to get into power.
Well, no, he basically, in that same rationale, he contradicted himself. So he said it's Putin's fault, but it's the EU's fault and the NATO's fault for expansionism, and you can't have both ways. Like, not really. I think he's talking about, like, he's mixing moral causality and explanation causality and whatever. But with regard to that, it was a typical Russian talk. This is a really common talking point, and it's also empirically wrong. So there's this received idea that the Russians perpetuate that in 1991. Was it, or 1990 even? Anyway, Gorbachev said that agreed, or the US agreed with Gorbachev that NATO would never expand east of East Germany. And of course, the idea is that they have, but that was never agreed. This is a myth, and Gorbachev in 2014 came out and said that never happened. Putin still says that, and people like Nigel Farage still say that. And you're like, this is not true. And so the idea that we agreed that NATO would never move east, it was never a thing. But also, NATO doesn't move east. Like, when the Soviet Union fell apart, right, those Warsaw Pact countries went to NATO. NATO didn't go to them and say, we want you in our team. Please join us. Let's have a big gang with all of you guys in. Those countries said, Warsaw Pact sucked. We were forced to go into that. NATO is a voluntary organization, and we're going to use our agency to ask to join you.
But that notwithstanding, yeah. Let's just say you could. I can imagine Farage accepting all of those points and still saying it's moved the potentially conflicting partners closer together, and therefore making conflict more likely.
But you can't. To blame the EU or to blame NATO is to take away from the agency of those countries. So what Farage does is uses, and this is such a common thing. Like,
could you not? I mean, let's play devil's advocate here. I mean, like, I agree with you, and yada yada. But I mean, could you imagine a wise statesman saying, I don't know, we don't want to poke the bear, as it were, as Farage's term. So we will leave zone very clearly that we'll kind of have agreements with them, we'll support them in arms or what have you, but we won't allow them to come in. I know it's their free choice, etc. But
that's a problem.
We don't have to let them into the club, and it would be unwise to do so. You know, I'm not saying I agree with that, but is that the argument? The
problem here is that you then start seeing countries purely as a means to an end, or as political football. So this is a really common thing with Ukraine. Is that Ukraine is?
Don't we do that all over the shop anyway?
I guess. Nominally so, possibly more so. The point is that if you only see Ukraine as something that gets kicked around between the West and the Soviet Union, or the West and the Russian Federation, then you are forgetting the single most important component in that, which is Ukraine and their right to self-determination and their right to say what they want. Being
philosophical, I don't disagree with you, but if you push that argument to its logical conclusion, you could then say, but the Kurds haven't got the state that they want. You know, what other nationalities and ethnic groups around the world haven't got? So do you, to be consistent, would you have to go in like everywhere? Is it our business to be kind of enforcing all of these things around the world? So yeah, it's a more isolationist position to take, isn't it? I'm not.
I'm confused by the use of Kurds and whatnot. I mean, my simple opinion is, one, Ukraine or Poland or the Baltics or Finland or Sweden want to join NATO or the EU. So they want to do that. Two, it's also useful for them to be in NATO and the EU, and it works for the NATO and the EU. And three, and which is 2B, is that Russia is a big threat, right? And we need to deal with that, and one way is to allow these people to join us, to make sure that more of the world is on the side of the West and is on the side of Russia and China, BRICS, and so on and so forth. But essentially, it should be about the agency of the people and self-determination. Like, if you have people who have elected a government, and that government, so you had not Poroshenko, Yanukovych, who was the leader in 2013, that said, right, you've voted me in and we're going to go towards the EU. And then he got influenced by Russia and he said, actually, we're not going to go to the EU. So you had the Euromaidan protests going on, which kicked him out, basically. He fled to Russia. Surprise, surprise. And you had the Euromaidan protests, and then you had a new government came in, or you had... it wasn't a coup. It was literally someone fled, and then they had the voting in parliament, and etc., etc. And these are people saying, look, we know who we want to be. We know where we want to go. And we feel so freaking strongly that all of us came out and we were sniped at. We were sniped at by people. We had people dying, being shot. We had no weapons, and we stood there and we protested against what our violent government was dictating should be the case, even though we voted differently to that. We are enfranchised here, and we demand that our country reflects the will of the people. And then for the EU to turn around to that and say, screw you, because we don't want to poke the bear. How about the bear has responsibility for not feeling poked?
Yeah, well, and actually, I mean, and if you think about it, like in terms of, had we taken that more, I don't know, cautious line or what have you, saying actually we'll keep a kind of zone, a moat, let's say. Let's say we'll keep a moat between the Russia and NATO. Had we even done that, would they not have gone in anyway? Because I think they would have done. I think I mean,
Who's they? Who's they? Sorry.
Russians. So,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
actually, even if we'd have said no because we don't want to poke the bear,
Yeah.
I reckon we can't prove it because it's a counterfactual world, but because the mindset of Russia is this kind of wounded ego bear that needs to recapitulate its imperial prestige. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, sorry, Tom. I know that's okay. I was laughing. That was a good gag because, of course, we've got. See, yeah.
Can you play that
But
again? Because I couldn't see it. I didn't see it.
yeah, that's just what you saw earlier. So what's interesting about that is you're absolutely right, Rob, because the Baltics. So there's this theory that the Baltics haven't been attacked by Russia. So Russia would want Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia back for sure, right? They want Ukraine and they want the Baltics. Why are they taking Ukraine? Because they're not in NATO. The reason they haven't invaded the Baltics is precisely because they're in NATO. So the argument is can be that actually had Ukraine even been involved in NATO previously, if we got them into NATO, then Ukraine wouldn't have been invaded either in 2014 or in 2022.
Yeah.
But they were. So NATO works, and it's what people want to be a member of. And what happens is, as soon as you start saying we shouldn't do that because Russia gets annoyed, is that you allow Russia to dictate world geopolitics and you allow Russia to dictate the game. They set the red lines and say, if you do this, then we're going to nuke you. How about no, Russia? If you do this, we'll nuke you, or we'll get angry with you, or we'll sanction you. And we're forever living in the shadow of Russia, and they get to dictate to us what's going on.
And I think you said their psychology, like if you think of Syria, the intervention in Syria, sending their, what was it, diesel powered or whatever it was, aircraft carrier that was smoking massive fumes and broke down in the Mediterranean, and it was like shambolic. But they're just trying to mimic the US in Iraq. It's this constant ego, narcissistic thing is what I see Russia doing, or Putin's regime at least.
Yeah, I mean, goodness, we're going on from UK politics here to analyze Ukraine and Russia. But yeah, I could talk to you for a long time about how, like, Putin wants to be Peter the Great again, and he's going for expansionist Russia. It's nothing really to do with like that Ukraine is a part of us any more than it's just he has this essentialist view of what Russia is, and Ukraine's part of it. And but he doesn't really care about the people because he's happy to bomb the crap out of them. So it's more about this sense of this place, and for him to have a legacy. He wants to be Peter the Great II. So yes. But going back to UK political scene, which is probably loads of my viewers would be like, oh, really? I want to talk about Russia more.
It's just getting fun.
So we could talk about so many other aspects of the manifestos for each of these parties, but the essence of it is, to me, that the Conservatives have offered something that I don't think is particularly exciting. It's a bit desperate. They're basically tax cuts, nothing really for the young,
Having put taxes up the most since any post-war government. So is it actually a tax cut?
So there's the highest tax burden basically now, pretty much on par with the Second World War period. But we've got the highest tax burden, and that's happened under a Conservative government who is supposed to be good at tackling economic issues and shepherding our economy to a good place and having low tax, small government. And yet we've got to a position where we've got the highest tax burden. Now, what's interesting there is that their big thing for this next parliament would be tax cuts. So their whole thing really is about tax cuts. And it was very telling when there was a debate the other night, or one of these things where they roll out each person and then they get interviewed by the audience. It's a BBC one. And when Rishi Sunak was on, it came to this young guy at the end, and they said, right, you've only got 60 seconds. So sorry, we've run out of time, but what would you like to ask Rishi Sunak? He's like, what are you doing for young people? And Rishi Sunak kind of panicked and went, he went, so the national service. And the kid was like, yeah, whatever, not interested in that. And he's like, oh yeah, okay, tax cuts. And like, you can't get like a 19-year-old to go out and vote for the Conservatives because you've offered them tax cuts. That is something that appeals to someone that's been working for a long time. Yeah. And it just really spoke to me that the vision for the Conservatives was hastily put together and was not taking into account the breadth of the electorate. It's like, we know who our people are. They are kind of middle class or even working class, but right at center, people over the age of 55. If you look at the polling, there's basically the only area where they are competing is like over 60s, over 55s and 60s of Conservatives. So that summed it up for me. So I thought that was interesting.
It's interesting, Labour's proposal to bring in voting for 16-year-olds. So
and not the only one, Greens as well. Yeah.
Asked my son Tom, who is mentions Thomas, so he probably might watch this, who is 16 now, and I said to him, "What did you think of that? Do you think that's a good idea?" He's like, "No way." I was like, "No way! I don't trust my peers to vote on anything like that. They shouldn't be given the vote."
I agree with you actually, but not like a priority. I think if we had good quality political education from a very young age, actually, up to 16 and beyond, then I wouldn't be like during the Scottish referendum, they opened that up to 16-year-olds, and you could see that as a ploy to get the idealistic young Scottish voters who wanted independence but didn't understand the complexity of maybe like, trade and this and that and whatever. All right. Yeah, and you can see that as a ploy, but also that there was this movement in Scotland whereby a lot of the young electorate became politically engaged, and it ended up being quite positive as a whole. But I think in general, I didn't understand politics until I reached my 30s. Like, I was really politically naive until I was entering my 30s. I have to be honest.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, could you? I mean, especially, could you be paying tax as a 16-year-old?
Well, I don't know. You wouldn't reach a threshold. Yeah, so interesting.
No, you have to stay in work, don't you, till you're 18 now? So you have to stay in education.
Yeah, but you can have like a Saturday job or whatever.
Paper round, so you won't
paper round, but you'll be under the threshold.
Yeah,
unless you've got an amazing paper round.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, no tax without representation principle.
Yeah. So the Conservatives are big on like tax cuts. The Labour, I mean, Labour are all about like, we are not going to raise taxes, because traditionally the left have been seen as tax and spend, increase taxes. Taxes would go up, the tax burden, would go up slightly, but not in line with the trajectory it's on presently. And that's as far as Labour are concerned. I saw a comparison of the present Labour suggestions compared to, or the manifesto, compared to the last two Labour manifestos under Corbyn, and the amount of money that Labour are going to spend extra now is like this, compared to, I know that means nothing, but if you don't know the why, the axis, but it's like this compared to like Corbyn's previous one was that, and the one before was like that. And so actually the Labour Party are being very fiscally conservative. They are so worried about being seen as old school Corbyn left that they have gone totally centrist, and some would argue Tory light, to the point where it's not that much of a change, and it will essentially, unless the economy grows considerably, it will be a sort of austerity or very fiscally conservative government that comes in. So they are relying, because they can't put up taxes, they're relying on a lot of their income coming in from a growing economy. And they're looking at growing the economy in a number of different ways. One thing I do like about the Labour manifesto, I have to admit, is the National Wealth Fund and the Great British Energy Company that they're going to set up. And I think moves like this are really, really good. And that's what I'm particularly excited about.
Explain the National Wealth Fund maybe for people.
Well, I don't understand it like 100%, but it appears to be about £8 billion worth of investment that will go into things like port infrastructure. Here's a really good thing here's a local example. So you and I live on the south coast, right? In the south coast, we have where are we? Let's go to the UK. Where are you, UK? Here you are. So on the south coast, you have a couple of ports that are very close to us, right? We live down there, and there's Portsmouth that's here and Southampton that's there. Now, Southampton has a port that was privatized, and Portsmouth has a port that is essentially owned by the council. Southampton City Council is broke. Portsmouth City Council is not broke. Right. I don't know why we have this thing in the UK that we're afraid of national ownership of things like the railway. So it's really interesting that Reform have said that they are going to nationalise 50% nationalised and 50% for pensions, the utilities, the water and railways as well. Right. So this is where Reform are trying to attract the left wing working class voter, particularly because they're actually doing some quite left wing things there. They're a populist party that are doing that, but you've got that from the Greens and you've kind of got that from Labour as well. And an example of the like, why don't we have really useful like logistics, either like energy distribution or railways and things like that that command a very small profit margin. That means that when you have smaller profit margins, you get less investment from the private sector because they don't get much return on investment. So one of the best videos I watched recently was by Navarra Media that talked about green economics. And it was fascinating and saying that when you're talking about like investment in energy distribution, like you can't really privatize that because you make freaking no money on it and you won't get the investment. And that's where the government needs to have big, bold investment decisions. And I think things like operating ports, like the Portsmouth compared to Southampton, is a really good thing. So if we have a national wealth fund where we are investing in a green economy as well. So they're going to be doing that with the Great British Energy Company, setting up a nationalized energy company, but will also try and get us to net zero and work towards environmental goals, but also be investment in jobs and growing the economy. What you want to do is make green economically viable. That's the key. And you do that through those kind of, you know, when Obama got in 2000, or I don't know if it was his first or second term, where he said, like, we want to make the US the green, you know, the green tech leaders. Like, this is about future-proofing your economy. It's about saying that, look, this isn't about like being moralistic about the environment. This is saying we can see where the economy, where the world is going, and we want to be ahead of the game so that we are the biggest and best in green tech. Because that never really happened because people saw it too much in a moral dimension, China comes along and is the world leader in green tech, right? And what you do is you're handing the ball to China. So what we need to do is make really bold national investments. It's really freaking frustrating when we privatize our rail networks and we get like companies coming from abroad to run railways that are national rail companies from abroad. Like our energy company, E.ON,
EDF.
one of our EDF is a French company, and a French rail,
French company.
yeah, nationalized French company are investing in our private utilities and whatnot. And it's just like, what is going on there? So we are, instead of paying our government for our provision here, we are paying the French government. So because you don't want nationalized industries as the Conservative Party or whatever, because you don't want nationalized industries, you say we have to tender it out, privatize it, put it out to private companies. Other nations like Japan and France come and invest in our country, and we are paying them instead of paying our own government. It freaking annoys me. It's so short-sighted, and it's this desire to adhere to the free market economic principle too much.
It's where you need to be less ideological and more empirical, led by evidence. What works?
Well, yeah, and it was quite nice to see on the Green Party manifesto where they said we are going to use evidence-based policy making with regard to criminal justice and sort of drugs. So they're looking at I would assume going to somewhere like Portugal and saying, right, they decriminalize marijuana, they do decriminalize drugs, I think, as a whole, because there was this time, I don't know if anyone's seen the documentary, The 13th, which is about the 13th Amendment, which is about slavery. And it's about how there was a choice to make drugs a mental health or a health issue, like addiction, or do you make it a criminal issue? And as soon as you decide to make it a criminal issue, if there's a sector of society that's more prone to drug abuse because of poverty, then you can criminalize them. And if you criminalize them, you send them to prison. And if you send them to prison, predominantly, certainly in the past in America, they don't get the vote. So what you're doing is you're taking a segment of society and you're saying, we don't want you to vote because actually you're more likely to vote in this case for the Democrats. So we're going to imprison you. And this was the theory of the documentary, is that you had a choice of where you take drugs. And now we're getting to a point where we've criminalized drugs and it's not quite working. Right, something's still broken. There is addiction, which is a kind of mental health issue. There's a health issue as well, and there's a prison space issue. And we're spending an awful lot of money on a criminal justice system that perhaps we could deal with that better and more efficiently if we saw it as a health issue. And so Portugal have done that. Now, I need to look into the stats, but I guess the Green Party is saying we need to use evidence-based policy making to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck in terms of the criminal justice system, and certainly in terms of drug, because so many of our prison places are taken up by drug users.
Because there was that experiment in one of the US states, wasn't there, around cannabis that seems to have gone south as a gateway drug.
I don't know. I wouldn't like to comment because
Oregon or I can't remember where. Yeah, somewhere north.
Interestingly, some people are touting it as a really good way of raising taxes. As well, as soon as you decriminalize marijuana, for example, then you can whack a tax on it, and you can make money.
Control the strength of it, because obviously modern skunk marijuana type stuff is a lot stronger than
there's a really interesting thing that when I was watching analysis the other day, and this would go slightly left field here, and I wrote an article on this about 6 years ago. That was exactly on this. I think it's Aaron Bastani on Novara Media talking about this, saying that interestingly, when it comes to smoking is as a drag on health services and on society as a whole. He didn't go into as much detail, but it's basically there's a laugh. You get a lot of tax in from smoking, right? And the argument is, does that tax cover the amount of money spent on treating smoking and health issues and so on and so forth? And actually, I think it does, right? So actually, smoking kind of pays for itself. And I'm not a smoker, and I'm anti-smoking, etc., etc. But
that video as well, where they were saying actually, and they're kind of diseases where you would die pretty quickly. Whereas if you're healthy and you live to your 90s, you're a real drain on the health service, because that's a long, slow.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I wrote this article about 6 years ago because I had to think about, and I'm sure loads of other people have probably thought about this. It's nothing original, but for me it was original because I didn't read it I was like just having one of those long afternoons and a slow drink and thinking, right, that's amazing. So the idea is that if something kills you fairly quickly at the age of 50, then you are killed while you're still working. This is horrible because people will know people that are connected. So this is a very thought experiment way of looking at something, so please excuse me if this is insensitive, but if someone dies from like smoking at the age of 55, then they don't go through the welfare system post-retirement, so you're not paying them pension, they're not going through other health issues that are more chronic and more expensive. So dementia is now the biggest killer in the UK and has been for a number of years, and actually it's incredibly expensive and it's expensive to treat. So if people don't die I'm not like advocating people should die early, but you can make an economic or a political case for people being less of a cost to society, therefore cheaper for the welfare state. And if you want your best bang for buck in the case of paying taxes, then someone dying from lung cancer at 55 is better than someone dying at the age of 90 from dementia. So basically, if you're going to survive later in life, you're going to get cancer or dementia, and both of those are very, very costly. So
sort of Mr. Burns style right-wing politician. You're like, for those that know Yes Minister back in the 80s in the British series, it's like, I said, we'll give everybody free cigarettes under 50,
Yeah. Yeah, because actually it could pay you back in terms of saving you in a welfare state. But anyway, that's not apropos to anything in the manifestos.
I'm
But
wondering
although,
about,
having said that, like something like dealing with dementia is an incredibly important thing, because it is. I mean, I know that because sadly, I hope he's not watching, but my father's just started to go through that, and it is incredibly challenging and horrible to see, someone lose their humanity, like everything you know about who they are just starts dissipating, and it's incredibly sad. But it's also incredibly costly potentially, and for both your family and society. But yeah, sorry.
I was wondering, like, so the way we do politics. So this is a little bit of a hobby horse for me at the minute, but it's kind of, and I'm no expert, so I'm probably going to welcome to be corrected by people that historically know far more than me. But I kind of, all these elections get fought on these 5-year cycles, and they get fought on things like, well, we want a better NHS, we want a better economy, it's money. What's good for us now in our generation? I put a quote out the other day, didn't I? Edmund Burke, the conservative with a small c, political philosopher, saying actually society and politics in a sense is a contract between the dead, the living, and those not yet born. This long-term politics that we need to preserve, in a sense, the best of the past, look after the living, also be thinking about the people of the future. And it's like we seem to be just worrying in a sense about us and our generation now, but there's a somewhat of a concern I have in terms of something that's not talked about a lot in terms of Labour, but the Conservatives have also done this. Like Boris Johnson his stuff around proroguing Parliament and stuff. I think there's been a move, and I think one of the things I felt this when Blair was in charge, that there was a sort of attitude of paternalistic control, which I really didn't like. There was something it was really interesting. A little slip of the tongue, he said, in a discussion with Keir Starmer. I'll come back to the main point I was going to make in a minute, but Starmer and him discussing about a year ago, and he's like talking about Prime Minister's questions, and he's like saying, what that's like, and he reduced Prime Minister's questions from twice a week to once a week on a Wednesday. And then Keir Starmer was like, well, we could bring back, it used to be the case that the Prime Minister would, prompt a different minister to speak on different questions. And then Tony Blair said, yeah, but then you never know quite what they're going to say, do you? I was like, that's interesting. Because I think he was a bit of a control freak.
I think anyone who ends up being Prime Minister is probably going to be in that mode.
Yeah, but it was interesting. So I spent a load of time at the weekend looking at the development of the English Constitution, which is not a written document. It's a whole bunch of different documents: the Bill of Rights, Magna Carta version 1, 2, 3, 12, 15, 12, 17, etc. And the gradual. So we've got 800 plus years of evolution to get to the point where roughly in sort of 1866 we are in the situation where we have or was it 1688? I can't remember. Check it out, Wikipedia. Where we end up with parliamentary sovereignty. So this idea that your elected representatives make the law. That's where we get statute law from. So the courts, in terms of what they do in terms of common law, etc., is more the sort of minority stuff. This evolving ongoing is statute law that's always subject to revision. But Parliament is the supreme authority, and they're electable, and you can kick them out every 5 years. And what we got with New Labour was an increasing number of quangos, so these quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations. So you might have Nature England, there are all sorts of different organisations where power is delegated out to organisations that are not elected, not electorally scrutinizable, accountable. So the Supreme Court. So you end up in a position where, which is something that should belong to an American constitution, where you've got a much more codified system, not a system that's more organic with Parliament like we have in the UK. The very idea of you cannot have, it's a contradiction in terms, to have a Supreme Court and a Supreme Parliament. So we've got this contradiction now that's built into the system. I don't know. We've discussed this a little bit on and off, but I don't, because they've not really talked about it a lot. I kind of work on the premise that they're coming from the same kind of cut from the same kind of falling from the same kind of tree. That we're going to see more of this emphasis on quangos, non-governmental organisations.
Well, we know that Labour are going to introduce more quangos, and some of them seem to be fairly good, like a good concepts behind them. But yeah, I mean, if you're not a big fan of them, I mean,
yeah. But my theory is, like, it might be effective, and we're thinking about, okay, it works in the short term. What is the cost in the long term? So if you're getting the golden eggs, it might work now, but the longer term cost is you're eroding parliamentary democracy. Parliament becomes less and less important. Is that the dangerous slide to be going on?
well, I don't know that so Labour brought out a report through Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, a couple of years ago, that was talking about parliamentary reform. But it was a wide-reaching report that isn't going to be wholesale introduced. In fact, Labour have just been very narrow in some of the reforms they are proposing, which I think is sensible, by the way. And I think you were reacting against the whole report and the whole like kit and caboodle. But I'm not sure that that's at all what's going to happen, and it's certainly not in the manifestos, which is what.
Yeah, there's a little bit of me thinking, based on their track record, do I take the risk of voting for them? Do I just think about the NHS now? Do I just think about the economy for the next 5 years? What about people in 100 years' time? What about?
I don't think they're going to do any like those even like to reform the House of Lords will take some time to do, right? It's just not easy. Interestingly, the House of Lords reform. So in the UK, we have a second sort of parliamentary entity called the House of Lords that can delay things. They can amend laws. They can't block them per se, but anyway, they're becoming this burgeoning house where the ruling party gets to select people to go into the House of Lords, and they're supposed to be like experts in certain areas or people who have just given a lot of money to the political party, and also, there are some hereditary lords that just get it through birthright, and there are 29 bishops who get it because they're bishops. And so there are lots of. I'm one of them.
They got it originally. They were landowners originally. That was interestingly, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm one of the people that thinks they should be reformed. So Labour, for example, reform and eventually replace the House of Lords, starting by removing hereditary peers and introducing mandatory retirement for peers over 80 when a parliament ends. So on and so forth. So devolution, all sorts of other things. But this is one of the things. Changing minimum voting age from 18 to 16 years old in general elections. I don't agree with that, as mentioned. But yeah, that reform the House of Lords also for the Lib Dems, cap donations to political parties for Lib Dems, which I think is good as well. And then Green Party, they are. I think, yeah, replace the House of Lords with an elected second chamber. So everyone seems to be up for reforming the House of Lords, I think, apart from maybe replace the House of Lords with a smaller second chamber and end political appointees. So I'd agree with that from reform. I think it's Conservatives are the only ones that aren't going to do anything about that. So I broadly agree with all of those approaches because I think the House of Lords does need reform. That's what I have to say about that. Can I just say, Kevin Force, thank you very much. Gifted 10 AGP Geopolitics memberships. Thanks so much, mate. Really appreciate that. We have Paddy Pliner, obviously from Ireland, because Euros and talking about now, as a serious matter, how can a Labour government enforce issues like same-sex marriages or abortions onto Stormont? So Stormont's a Northern Ireland devolved assembly or parliament there. Surely the Shinners support it and the DUP loves the union. I don't quite know how to answer this question. So this is
Shinners being the Sinn Féin.
This is like, how do you? I mean, I guess the question is, how do national government initiatives work with devolved governments, especially when there might be sort of civil rights involved, that becomes pretty sticky. And I guess this is maybe like the issue in the US between sort of federal laws and states laws and so on and so forth, and things like abortion in the US being such a hot potato topic at the moment, whereby should this be something that is agreed upon by states or by the nation itself? And I things like that, I don't understand why states get to make like really, really significant legal choices themselves. Like I don't know. I don't know how I feel about, like, if it's that important, and if it's agreed. This is why I think the Supreme Court should be making judgments. But then if you have the Supreme Court that get their people elected by political appointees themselves, then it becomes a politicized mechanism and process. And so it's all really problematic, the whole kind of state versus federal versus SCOTUS versus POTUS versus Congress, and it's all just a big hot mess over there. That's my tuppence on the American political system.
That's Americans. I mean, I suppose Paddy's bringing up the issue there of more broadly, without getting into the nitty-gritty of those particular issues. It's like, what right do the regions have to self-determine in terms of, their parliamentary representation? So it's interesting because, like, I suppose Labour were the ones to bring about devolution, and I know when I looked at the constitutional plans the other day, there's Gordon Brown's talked about more plans to empower the English regions as well, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is that Northern Ireland has a very much a much more religious dimension to the rest of the UK, particularly England and Wales, where we're kind of religiously apathetic, and we're a funny country whereby we are technically we're not a secular nation, mechanistically. Like, we've got head of the Church of England is the king, and etc. We have like lords that are bishops by right in the House of Lords, and so on and so forth. So we're not secular, but we are effectively secular, where the US is a secular nation that is incredibly religious. So this is weird dichotomy there, but or contradiction, where Paddy here says, they can they overrule those moral policies and laws that are put in place by central government. And I don't know enough about the powers of the devolved governments as to what they can do there, but I'm sure that it seems to be clear that they can.
Like a discussion that was going on in the context there at Jimmy.
Yeah. But it is apropos to what he asked us. Richard Bennett, thank you very much for gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Really, really appreciate that. Thanks to all of your kind words. I don't know if he's gone now, but King Raccoon did say, ATP, you still don't get what Brexit was about. It was about our council estates not being given to Eastern Europeans. And yeah, I do get what Brexit was about, because I debated it twice, and I said that that's precisely what it was about, which was immigration. I know people dressed it up with ideas of sovereignty and ideas of this and that and rules coming from Europe. But if you ask someone, okay, what rule from Europe don't you like? Then they go, and they actually have no ideas of the rules coming from Europe. But it was predominantly about immigration. And I think that's what the stats bear out in terms of polling and surveys and whatnot.
Although as a Remain voter, as I was, I remember umming and ahhing a little bit over the democratic issues. So back to that constitution concern again, that I remember us discussing, actually, that EU's not as democratic as it could be.
Of course it. Yeah,
I did European studies as my degree at university. In terms of the way the Commission and the Council and everything set up, it's actually not. You're not very highly represented. So
but I think it's almost, you are represented. It is democratic, but when you have like 500 million people from different countries, it's very difficult to achieve that pragmatically.
It pushes power further away from the people. So that's my objection to it. I still think that. So that would be my. So this is why we get. This is why it's like, actually, are you Remain or leave? It's actually, it's more nuanced than that. Like, on balance am Remain.
Yeah.
or was Remain. But actually, there are problems with the
Yeah.
EU. From my point of view, actually,
Hopefully agree.
it's that same thing I said about the Constitution. Actually, you're pushing what was, I think, a really lovely, the mother of all parliaments that's been remodeled all over the world, a unique historical flowering of democracy in a sense. I think the EU hasn't captured that. It's a very different thing. It's far powers are removed. It's much more legalistic, I think.
And I love how you say that, because for me, the EU was like, I didn't want to get into the long weeds of the intricacies of the EU and actually some of the pros and cons. For me, it was almost like an intuition, a blue sky thought process. And why I mention this now is because that's my approach to this election as well. So for me, I was a Remainer because I was like, right, there are global problems, and you can only solve global problems with global solutions. And we need to work together to sort out tax evasion. We need to work together to sort out environmental issues. And climate change. You know, the EU is the best vehicle to do that. We need to work together to sort out, you know, these cross-country issues. And for me, that was really important. And when it comes to this election, we can talk about some of these smaller areas of policy making and manifesto. But for me, it's about what is the direction I want this country to go in, one of like conservatism in terms of economics, really. Like, I would like more ownership. I'm a classic kind of mixed economy guy, right? I'm actually quite centrist economically speaking. Like capitalism, I am pro-capitalism, but it needs to be constrained by sensible strategic management. And in fact, that's what's it called, securonomics, that Keir Starmer is going for, which is a version of this, which is using the private sector but strategically planning it, and that's part of what he's doing, which is, I think, eminently sensible, but also retaining things to the national. I get really pissed off, right?
Yeah,
sorry, I know you're trying to say something.
It's great having national socialist goals in terms of the economy of the state and capital cronyism. We've seen that in the 1930s in Germany.
But what really, like, I've got some Norwegian viewers, no doubt, here, right? Put your hands up.
I actually agree with you, by the way. Sorry.
Yeah.
Economy stuff.
But like, what annoyed me, like this, the great example for me is what happened with the North Sea oil reserves. So Norway and UK found the North Sea oil reserves. We went, we're all about free market economics, so we just opened that up to BP and Shell and whoever wants to take it out the sea. Brilliant, you go for it. Take it out of the land, and we'll tax you a little bit occasionally when we feel like it, and you can make freaking loads of money. Fantastic, go for it, because free market economics is perfect. And Norway went, that's our kind of land, or our maritime sort of nautical area, so we kind of own that, and if you want that, we're gonna have a lot of the pie that you're going to be making, baking out of that. And they put that into the sovereign wealth fund, and as a result, they can pay their pensions now out of all the oil revenues that they've been gathering over decades and decades and decades. And what happened during the Ukraine war energy crisis? We had to create a government charity to help pay the energy bills of our poor people in the UK who couldn't afford the hike in energy prices, while BP and not only the producers but the distributors of hydrocarbons and energy were making more money than they'd ever made. The treasurer of BP said, I quote, "We've got more cash than we know what to do with," to shareholders in the shareholder meeting. So at a time when we had to generate a freaking charity to pay for the fact that energy prices were so high, our energy companies were making a killing, almost literally a killing. And I just thought that's absolutely disgusting. that this was the case, and yet we just sit there and allow that to happen. There's no windfall tax, there's no anything. It's just like you can make crazy money and you can offshore that, and we'll tax you on relatively little amount of it. Meanwhile, Norway are sitting pretty on the same kind of resources, and they're paying for their pensions. And it's like, so that's what I like about the sovereign wealth fund that the Labour Party are thinking about setting up, and that's what things like that for me are like big ticket winners. Anyway,
so if you're looking across all these manifestos, I've got two questions. One will be, I'd be quite good.
Yes. So let's start drawing this to something of a conclusion.
So one would be, where do you see us being in 5 years' time, which might be interesting to come back to in 5 years' time? What do you think will actually pan out? Let's say Labour get in. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other one is like looking across all the manifestos. If you could recreate your own party and pick a mix from across the manifestos, what would be your ideal super party?
Well, it would be elements of Green, Lib Dems, Labour, but actually also like there's a couple of reform policies, like getting rid of student debts for nurses, for example, to try and attract nurses and retain nurses. I think is a really sensible idea. So there's a couple of reform and, you know, taking on utilities, but they're not the only ones to say that. But yeah, so there's weirdly some reform things, but there's I think Labour Lib Dem, we haven't really gone into Lib Dems, but there's quite a lot of the Lib Dem stuff that's quite sensible. Mental health, they're really big on with Lib Dems, which I think is really, really important. Some stuff to do with tech as well. We haven't really touched on tech. We don't have time. But it would just be a pick and choose. And maybe that then speaks to, I know you've often advocated like referenda on policies like Switzerland, which is like, I'm not voting. Yeah, you will vote in elections to get a kind of direction of government. But when it comes to really big policy changes, you put that out to the people and say, okay, we're going to educate you on this policy and you get to decide whether we as a government take on this policy or not. Here are all the pros, here are the cons, here's all the information, you guys decide. And that I think is a wonderful way. And you need to make, so for me as well, I would have also been trying to make voting easier. So the whole thing about voter ID and like voter fraud is so minimal. It's the same in the US, despite what the MAGA Republicans will tell you. The US had the safest, most secure elections recently, and the voter fraud is not a big thing. I would be trying to make it as freaking easy as possible for people to vote. But alongside that, I know that I'm going off on one here, but alongside that, I would also if I had a manifesto, at the center of it would be political education for kids and adults. I spoke to someone the other day who's a single mum, 30-something. She said, I don't know who the ruling party is. I don't know. I've never voted. None of my friends have voted. Literally no one. She's a lovely, lovely woman and everything. But none of her friendship group was politically active or politically knowledgeable. And that was an absolute crime in my books.
It's interesting, isn't it? We won't mention any particular cases, but we were teachers and we were aware of, teachers who didn't know who was in power, didn't know what the parties were about, etc., etc. And it's like, wow, gosh, if your educators don't know those things,
we were literally in a staff room, and there was another teacher who was like, I don't know who. It was when David Cameron was in charge. It's going back a few years, and it's like, I don't know who the Prime Minister is, and I don't know who you've got a degree, you're teaching, and yet you don't know who the Prime Minister and the political party in charge of your own country is. What the frick is going wrong? Just mad. So yeah, I think political education is really important, but I also think we should make it damn easy to vote. And I think I quite like the Australian way, which is like, is it the first election is compulsory, which kind of gets you into voting. I don't know that it's every election. I think it's maybe your first election, which I like that, which then means you kind of like, even if some people are just ticking whatever, there will be a lot of people who are being forced into starting to think about politics there. But I would make electronic voting, like, for goodness sake, if I can do all my banking on an app, then you can pretty much make sure I can do a secure vote. I know that there are security issues surrounding that, but look, if we can do it with money, you can do it with voting, I'm sure.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So 5 years time.
Well, yeah. So just before you do that, Tom, mate, thank you so much for this. We did address this. Sorry if you've already addressed this, but what do you make of Starmer saying that the UK won't join the single market or customs union in his lifetime? I think it was an ill-conceived time to state that, and I think it was a bad idea. But Rob's position is a pretty astute one, which is he wouldn't have said that, who probably wouldn't have said that, had he not had a load of data. Like, it's just not off the cuff. There would have been data, and I think it's to do with stopping a bleed to reform. So I think he's trying to keep the left-wing reform voters on side. But I think I would have just been vague. I would have said, yeah, maybe we could join the customs union at some point going forward. Who knows? It depends what the people want. And like, you could almost say, like, you know, it's up to the people. If there's a referendum in the future again, then we'll let them decide. But anyway, we did talk about it. Thanks so much, Tom, for supporting the channel. Really, really appreciate that. But it's such a good question. I can't believe that came out the night before, because as I said earlier, I know one person at least who's contacted me, said I'm not going to vote Labour now. So there you go. And I don't think you're going to get people going, yeah, I'm definitely going to vote Labour now. He said that.
I mean, the other side of it might be, I mean, that's probably the reason is to do with the reform votes, or he wanted to have this on the table before getting elected in, but didn't want to open that can of worms for debates earlier on in the process.
Yeah. I'm sure there'll be reasoning behind it. What would I like the country to look like in 5 years?
No. What do you think it will look like?
Oh, right. Oh,
yeah.
Goodness. I don't know. Hopefully more investment in public services. I'd like more investment in the NHS. I'd like green energy to be featuring with logistics put in place. People say that green energy is expensive and net zero is all expensive, etc., etc., etc. They don't understand something called negative externalities and also subsidies. There's I've got them. Goodness me. I could show you if I wanted, because I've actually got them open because I was going to talk about them the other day. No, I've closed them. Damn me. But there are I have closed them actually. So there are 5 different Forbes articles I had up, which is all to do with basically people don't realize how much the fossil fuel industry is subsidized. It not only subsidized, but you pay for it through things called negative externalities and how you overcome them. So a negative externality in economics is an external cost to creating a widget. And sorry, I've said this before to some of my viewers, but if I create a widget, right, and in creating that widget, it's cheaper for me to create that widget if I pollute the river, right? Rather than do something so I don't pollute the river. It costs me more not to pollute the river. So I make the widget, I pollute the river. The widget is cheap, right? But the cost of making the widget is the pollution of the river. Now, who bears the cost of the pollution there? Now, if there's no regulation, the cost of that pollution is on society. And if someone wants to clean up the river, then that cost of me making money from making the widget is borne on the people clearing up the river. It's a negative externality. So it's a negative cost to my producing the widget, right? The free market doesn't do a very good job of sorting out negative externalities. So the government has to come in and say, hang on, you can't do that to our rivers. So either the government comes in and cleans it up, and then that cost is borne on the taxpayer, or they come along and they regulate and they say, you are not allowed to pollute rivers. If you pollute the river, we will fine you. And that means that me as a company, because I don't want to be fined, or I work out whether the fine is going to cost more than the money I make, but I would say, right, I'm going to make it more expensive to make widgets because I'm regulated to do so. And that means the widgets are more expensive, and that cost is passed on then to the consumer, which is how it should be. It's passed on to the person who's using the thing that I'm making. I shouldn't be making this and causing. So in the early days, I could make coal by getting 7-year-olds down the coal mine. But the external negative externality to that is that kids don't have education, kids don't have blah blah blah. Then there's all these like health and safety, and people die from coal dust and blah blah blah. So governments regulate and regulate and regulate until eventually we get to now where we go, right, we don't have 70-year-olds working down a mine, and you can't pollute a river. But people are always banging on about, oh, regulation's so bad. No, it's not. Regulation is good because it keeps us safe, and it means that the people making this stuff are responsible for paying for screwing things up if they make that stuff, rather than just making pure profit out of the environment or out of health or whatever. So there's a really long way around answering your question, which is I've even forgotten where I was going. You asked me what, I don't know, what was I talking about?
Oh, something.
Yeah. So basically,
5 years time. Yeah. So green energy.
Yeah, so
more infrastructure.
Yeah, that was it. So, okay, when you are talking about green energy being expensive, A, it has come down hugely in price, so it's now price competitive. But B, it's price competitive, and you're not even often taking into account how much the governments, so the US government subsidizes the fossil fuel industry in America, in the US, by a freaking massive amount, right? And then the negative externalities of the fossil fuel industry, so the slag heaps ruining the rivers and all this stuff, that's then picked up by local states or local, by people themselves, or health issues. If you take into account negative externalities compared to the renewable energy sector, then the fossil fuel industry is subsidized by the taxpayer even more. So people don't realize how much in America that they are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And then they look at it and go, God, the fossil fuel industry is really freaking cheap. Oh my goodness, solar's really expensive. Why are we putting money into solar? Solar panels don't get subsidized by the government. Fossil fuel industry does get subsidized by the government. Negative externalities are much higher in the fossil fuel industry, and that gets subsidized by the taxpayer. You need to understand this to understand that if you were to give the renewables energy sector the leg up that you give the fossil fuel sector, then renewables will be even freaking cheaper. Anyway, so what I want to see in 5 years, I don't know if we'll see it, but if we're going in this direction with Labour and the Sovereign Wealth Fund and Green British Energy Company they're going to set up as a national entity, we will see a cleaner energy sector that's also means that we will be more energy independent, and we won't have to be importing stuff from, say, Russia or America or LNG or whatever. Hopefully, that's something we'll see in 5 years. But sorry, I've spoken too long.
No, yeah, with nuclear energy,
and I do think we need nuclear in the mix as well.
Which is odd that the Greens dropped that, but yeah.
It's always 50-50 split, the Greens. I could show you a book I had when I was at uni called Green Political Thought, and that was nuclear was you had half the green people saying nuclear is terrible, and then the other half saying actually it's pretty good because there's no carbon footprint or whatever. So,
especially if you get fusion in the future, but yeah.
Right, okay, just before we go, mate, let's make a prediction about what's going to happen. I'm amazed that people are still here, by the way. Thank you very much. So here's something from JR Jeroen. Thanks for joining, mate. I didn't know whether you were there. Annually, 37.5 billion euros in subsidies goes to the fossil fuel sector in the Netherlands. Would guess that it is way more in Great Britain. Wow. There you go. But people don't see that. And when they say, oh, we're having our bills put up because we're trying to get to net zero, they don't understand that their bills are effectively higher for the amount of subsidization of the fossil fuel industry anyway.
And we need to move into a more actual real green energy as well. It's things like we're importing electricity from abroad that's actually burnt in coal-fired stations in Belgium or the Netherlands or what have you. And then going, oh, it didn't come from any of our, and then counting that as green energy. It's like the things like that going on.
I don't know about the details of that, but yes, I would agree if that's the case.
Yeah.
So when we have, I'm actually going to look at where are you? Here you are. Sorry, I've got to get things on the right screen. Okay, so I'm going to go to, let's say, I think looking at this 16% reform, I think that these are my predictions, right? I think reform will get more than 16% of the vote, and I think there's a shy reform voter out there, and they will mobilise more of the vote than the Conservatives. I think Conservatives will get tonked. The question is how much. I think Labour will bleed some to reform, and that might help the Tories in some seats.
Which is why he said what he said today, because that's what they're saying.
Yes. And I think because in many seats there isn't an official progressive alliance, that the left will still get split. So my local constituency, or not my local one, but the one next door, a place called Fareham, has Suella Braverman, who's a very right-wing conservative politician who's hard on immigration. She's been the Home Secretary previously, and she's incredibly anti boat people and whatever. So you might think she's the one you'd vote for if you were a reform-thinking voter. But Reform are so annoyed with the Conservatives that you've got loads of Reform voters rejecting her. So the Fareham constituency is split, Reform and Conservative. This would be a perfect time for one of the parties to come along and take that. However, Labour and Liberal Democrats are neck and neck in Fareham, which means that they have split their vote, which means that the Conservatives will probably still get in. So that is a sort of situation whereby you will get Conservatives getting in with a 35% majority, which is why first past the post is not very good, because 65% of the people in Fareham might be anti-Suella Braverman, and yet she gets in, even though the majority of the people don't like her.
Well, and the same with Labour if they get in on 40%.
True. Yeah. That's an example. It's the same for any politician that can get in with less than 50% of the vote in any constituency in the UK. Yeah. Although this is why second votes are quite useful, because I think it can tease this out. But basically, I think there are some constituencies where, Braverman's quite a good example, where there's a lot of people that really don't like her. Whereas where Labour might get in somewhere, but actually they would get the second vote of, say, the Lib Dem or the Green. And do you know what I mean? So it's not quite as simple as that. And this is why I think second vote, rank voting is quite useful. They tried that. A few places in the US have tried that. Alaska and Maine have rank voting now and ranked choice voting, and that's pretty good. It's a step forward. But my theory is, so you get these different. You tell me what you think, because I'm going to find a really interesting website that someone put me onto earlier. So you tell me what you think is going to happen.
I think Labour will win. I agree with you. I can see Reform becoming the opposition in a sense, not in seats, but in vote share. So that would be interesting to think about.
Who do you think will get an opposition? Sorry.
Not sure. The Lib Dems could become the opposition, couldn't they? Isn't that the thinking?
So here is the latest aggregation of predictions for the general election across loads of different surveyors, right? So we have 650 is all of the seats, constituencies. So Britain predicts, Economist, Election Map, so on and so forth. So we've got a range of, say, 469 is the highest, 498 is the highest. Wow. So that has Conservatives down at 53, but Salvation, I wouldn't. I think that's these Savanta and Salvation have the Conservatives. This is even worse. So 516 for the Labour is the highest, and then 425 is the lowest. But even if 400, goodness me, I mean, it looks like the Conservatives are in real trouble there. I would err on the lower side of the not because I'm just trying to be conservative here, as in small c conservative, cautious, but I think Labour will bleed quite a bit to Reform, and I think that you might get some shy Tory voters and shy Reform voters, which are people who in polls say, "Oh, I'm going to vote Labour," but when they get into the secrecy of the polling booth, will vote Conservative or Reform. I think you will get a handful of Reform. I think it'll be nice to get 4 Green, because I think it'll be nice to see them grow and start challenging and becoming part of the political landscape more officially. I think Lib Dems will not beat Conservatives, but if they do, that will be absolutely freaking historic because they would be the opposition and not the Conservatives. And if that happens, Conservatives have taken a tonking.
And in terms of where we sit in the next 5 years, I'm thinking. I was listening to Alistair Campbell this morning. Rory Stewart was away, but actually they were saying they're not going to have a very long honeymoon period, the same as Blair had in '97. So if he doesn't deliver on stuff, and he's going to struggle to deliver because it's going to be, quite economically constrained, it's going to be quite a lot of criticism. So I can see it may not get a second term. I think the next election is going to be even more interesting. I can see reform. I don't think. See, the question is reform, if they're growing, are they going to put a lot of Conservative ministers and MPs over in terms of defection? Are we going to see the end of the Tory party is what's been discussed? I mean, I don't think we will, but anyway, are we going to see reform effectively broadening its nature, so it becomes a kind of replacement Conservative party potentially?
So here's the thing, a really good point about like they won't have a honeymoon period. What happened in 1997? I remember I was in my first year of uni. I'd taken a year off, been backpacking, went to uni. It was like, oh, there's an election. Everyone was pissed off with 18 years of a Conservative government, and you had people voting left, right, and centre for Labour. It was Cool Britannia. They had a theme tune, "Things Can Only Get Better," that was done by D-Ream. Dr. Brian Cox was playing on keyboards for them for a period. It was indie. Britpop was around. Britain was in this really positive place, culturally, and there've been 18 years. People are fed up with the Tories, etc., etc. And so what happened? I remember walking around my halls. I was at Leeds University. I was at Clarence Dock, sort of these halls of residence, brand new. They'd just been built, like these flats, and it was party time. Everyone's out into the night. Must have been a summer election, and people were freaking partying. And I was like, this is really interesting. I bet you hardly any of these people know what the manifestos are for each of the parties, and I bet there's a good deal of political ignorance, and yet everyone's just having a party. And it got to this stage where just people wanted to change, but I think Labour would have been afforded a big honeymoon period then, because people were voting kind of for Labour, but also against Tories, but actually for a positive vision of Britain. It's Cool Britannia. Tony Blair was really charismatic at the time, and this was a very positive vision of what the UK was going to be. I don't think you have that with Labour now. People are voting only against the Tories, and I think as a result there will be, exactly as you say, a very short honeymoon period. And I think people will demand of Labour bigger changes maybe than they are willing to certainly pay for and give at the moment.
So the interesting election is going to be the next one.
Yeah, and the question is whether reform will merge with Conservatives. Some people are saying that actually Nigel Farage is playing the long game in going for 2029 prime ministership.
Yeah, I mean, I've listened to a few of them in sort of discussions and whatnot, and then that's their plan basically.
Yeah,
and they don't want to sort of see get their seat at the table in the Conservative Party. They want to destroy it. Some of them.
Yeah,
but yeah, hey, people say things.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. I think next 5 years, this Labour term will be very interesting. I think I'll be looking at it much more closely than I've been looking at the last Conservative term, which is like, meh, more Tories. I know what's going to happen. Tax cuts. Oh no, we're paying more tax, and there seems to be no kind of inward investment that's I think bold. I'm hoping Labour can give something, but it will be tampered with trying to hold that middle ground and trying to be fiscally conservative. So, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I will be voting myself. I know that you're not going to say, but I will vote Labour, but that'll be a tactical vote. It's an anti-Tory vote. I don't know if this was proportional representation. I don't actually know who I'd vote for. I really don't. It would be Labour, Lib Dem, or Greens. It would be like a mixture of all of those, because I don't agree with all of them, and there's some bits, we haven't talked about. Say, for example, Israel, Gaza, and we haven't talked about, certain bits and pieces, but it would probably might be Lib Dem. But
it's difficult. I mean, I literally haven't decided yet. I mean, I will be. There's strong things I dislike about every other party. I know that's a kind of negative way to look at it. I think someone once someone said the other day, you rarely get what you want, what you vote for. Vote against what you don't want.
Right. Okay. So because a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm bored. I'm fed up of voting against someone. I want to vote for someone." But I like that, because very often you vote for something and they just don't. Just don't. I just don't want these people.
Yeah. I won't tell you who said it then.
Okay. Yeah. No, probably don't. So anyway, thank you very much for listening to us bang on, predominantly me. And sorry, Rob, I did take up a lot of the speaking time there. I do apologise. Is there anything you want to say? I mean, any worries that you have? What are you are looking forward to? Maybe.
I mean, so let's assume Labour get in, which I think is pretty likely. What I'd be looking forward to out of their reign, if you like, would be we just need some serious investment. We need some actual, need to have a vision and some coordination and think long term. You've got to invest. And the other side, what I'm not looking forward to is perhaps more Blair control freakery, which may or may not happen. But
yeah, I listened to the entire Labour manifesto on audio just as a bit of research, and actually I came away, and I know it's like I wasn't being critical about it. A lot of these aren't funded, so we didn't really talk about this, but okay, really quickly, Greens and Reform are pie in the sky stuff, which is what you can say when you're not seriously going to get in. So you might like some things on Reform, but it's shy of $50 billion worth, 50 billion quid's worth of funding. Like it is. So the Reform contract would not work. The Greens is shy of a load of money. I don't know about
lists.
Yeah, so I think the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, did an appraisal of all of them and said they're all basically a bit rubbish for funding. But Labour, I think, came out the best, but partly because they were so vague. So no one's quite sure even like what's like the how they're going to achieve. So some of the things in the Labour policy, like, yeah, that's so when I was listening to it, I was like, yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant. Oh, I feel really positive about the Labour thing. Then I was thinking, that's because you hadn't told me how you're going to do that. Like, I can promise like loads of really cool things, but if you don't tell me how you do it, it's kind of irrelevant. So I think the Labour's a lot of that, which is a lot of headline stuff, but not a lot of the detail and the costings of exactly how you're going to do that. And then a lot of vagueness because they're really worried about getting in and having no money left. This is one of the things, I don't know, I said this to you earlier, I don't think I said it on the stream, which is that Labour are really apparently very worried about getting into power and there being no money, which is why they've not had some of the typically big top ticket Labour sort of policies, which are going to cost 10 billion quid, because they've been told that there's just no money left in the coffers. So there is that. But the costing is important for it to be realistic, and it's very easy to just promise the moon on a stick when you're an opposition party, and I think we need to be wary about that from those opposition parties. But you said, and you said it a number of times, is long-term strategizing. I know I keep saying we're going to go now, we will go after this. I said this recently, and you've said it a number of times, and it's spot on. So the 4-year election cycle in the UK does not lend itself to long-term strategizing. I said this with regard to China the other day. Now, this is not advocating dictatorship, right? But China's advantage over us is Xi Jinping has made the situation whereby he ain't ever going to get voted out, right? He's in for the long haul. And that means he can say, where do I want China to be, not in 4 years' time, but in 24 years' time? Like, what is China's position in the world? And how can I put things in place now that are going to come to fruition in 20 years? Now, we don't think like that in the UK or many countries around the world, because we do not have an electoral system that can entertain that kind of thinking. Unfortunately, democracies don't work like that. And that's a real shame in that context, because actually we are very, very short-termist. Whereas China can put the Belt and Road Initiative in, start getting infrastructure sorted all around the world. Now you can, I don't think that's nice, and it's not morally the right thing to do, whatever. But if you're like, how do I make the world better? Or how do I make, with Xi Jinping, it's like, how do I make China's lot better in like 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years? He goes and does things to that effect. But if we were like, how can Britain be a really positive place, and how can the world be a much more positive place in 20 years? We don't think like that because of our political system, and that is to the detriment of us and our future.
We need, instead of MAGA hats or MABA hats, we need make the world great again hats.
Mawa. Yes,
yeah.
we need to think about that one. Yes. Ed Delves. Yeah. I'm progressive by nature, but I wish we could turn the clocks back to a time when children weren't stabbing each other. That's such a difficult one to solve. That there's poverty, there's education, there's aspiration, low aspiration communities. There's a really wonderful book I read, one of my favorite books I've ever read, actually, by Akala, called Natives. If you want to get an audiobook, make sure you get the audiobook of him reading it. It's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, yes. So, Rob, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the audience for sticking out with us for so long. That's amazing. And no, Tom, I'm not saying we should be a communist dictatorship. That is definitely not what I'm saying. I'm just saying 20 years
a capitalist dictatorship.
Yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Benign dictatorship. Honestly, if you guys vote for me, I will be... I will make it so that I rule forever for the rest of my lives. But honestly, I'll be a nice guy. I will be really benign, and I'll make sure that all my decisions are for the benefit of the country. Honestly, please make me a dictator.
We're back tomorrow, aren't we?
Yes. So this is what we are thinking, is doing a bit of a live stream, but I'm going to go to the pub first, and this could be ill-advised. But we might, at about 11:30, Rob, it's probably a little bit later than you were thinking. But if we might just do a little bit of a live stream to see what the exit polls are and stuff is. And if anyone wants to join us, you can. We're not forcing you. But if you want to have a pint with us during election night, yeah, like as a benign dictator, I won't force you. But if I was like 5 years into my rule, I probably would force you, or start forcing you.
Depends on the size of your secret police force at that point.
Massive. Yeah, definitely massive. Anyway, thank you, guys. And I really appreciate it. Finish, guys. Interesting, even from a foreigner's point of view. Thank you, JP, and all stream participants, and Rob, of course. Thanks, mate. I really appreciate that. Look, I am legend of the universe has turned into benign dictator of the multiverse. Brilliant. Personal, private jokes here, Rob. You won't. Anyway, thank you, guys. We are going to rejoin you guys tomorrow night. I might be a little bit inebriated, but we'll talk about the stats coming in, and I'll probably have the BBC, because they do a really good live thing in the background, and we can talk. If you guys are up for that, we'll be good for it. Hey,
swingometer?
Yes, the swingometer. Yes. Was Jeremy Vine previously doing that. Anyway, thanks, guys. Rob, stay on the line. Take care, y'all. Have a good night. Toodle pits.